Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day's still hanging around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Where are you listening from tonight? What does the evening feel like where you are, I wonder? I hope it's peaceful. I hope you've found a comfortable place to settle. Tonight, we're travelling to a group of islands, small islands, limestone islands in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, places most people have heard of, perhaps visited on holiday, places known for clear water and ancient walls and honey-coloured stone glowing in the sun. But there's something else on these islands, something older than almost anything else humans have ever built. Temples, stone temples, massive chambers and courtyards carved and raised by people who had no metal tools, no written language, no wheels. People who lived and worked and worshipped there more than 5,000 years ago. We're going to explore the megalithic temples of Malta. These are structures that predate the pyramids of Egypt. They predate Stonehenge. They are among the very oldest freestanding stone buildings anywhere on Earth. And yet, for thousands of years, they were forgotten, buried, silent. The people who built them left no written records, no names, no explanations carved into the stone, just the temples themselves waiting beneath the soil. A like or subscribe would mean a great deal if you're so inclined. It helps this space find others who might need it. Now settle in, feel whatever's around you, the warmth, the weight of blankets, the surface beneath you. Let your breath slow. There's no rush tonight. We have hours together and we're going to move slowly through time, deep time, the kind of time that makes centuries feel like moments. Picture this, if you can. Imagine standing on a small island under a Mediterranean sky. The wind carries the scent of salt and wild thyme. The limestone beneath your feet is warm from the sun, pockmarked and weathered by millennia of rain and wind. And before you, rising from the earth, are stones, massive stones, some as tall as a person, some much taller, arranged in patterns, forming chambers, creating spaces that feel both open to the sky and somehow enclosed, sacred maybe, or at least intentional. These stones have been here since before Rome, before Greece, before the first Egyptian pharaoh. They've watched the stars wheel overhead through 5,000 summers. They've felt the rain of 5,000 winters. And they're still here. The people who built them are not. That's the mystery we're stepping into tonight. Not just what these temples are, but who built them, why they built them, what they believed, what they hoped for, what they sang or chanted in those stone chambers under the same stars we see tonight. We'll never know all of it. Most of it is lost, but we know some things. We've learned some things. And the rest, well, the rest we can wonder about together. The islands are called Malta and Gozo. The temples have names too. Names given to them later by people who rediscovered them. Gantija, Hagar Kim, Menidra, Tarxian. Strange names, perhaps, but they're just sounds in the end. What matters is the stone, the silence, the sense of standing before something that has outlasted everything we think of as permanent. So let's begin. Let's go back, not just centuries, but millennia, back before these temples existed, back to the world that gave birth to them, back to the islands rising from ancient seas, waiting for the first humans to arrive. Take a breath. The story starts long before the stones were raised, long before any temple stood on Malta, long before any human foot touched these islands. There was only water. The Mediterranean Sea has always been here, more or less. But it hasn't always looked the same. It hasn't always held the same stories. If you could rewind time, millions of years, tens of millions, you'd see something different. A vast ocean called Tethys. Warm, tropical waters, stretching where Europe and Africa now press close together. And beneath those waters, sediment settling, layer upon layer. The shells of countless tiny creatures drifting down through the darkness, accumulating on the seafloor, limestone in the making, the very bones of the islands forming slowly in the deep. Geological time moves differently than human time. It doesn't rush, it doesn't hurry. 1,000,000 years is nothing. 10 million years barely registers. The limestone that would become Malta was laid down during the Oligocene and Miocene epochs, between about 30 and 5 million years ago. Those are just numbers, of course. They're hard to hold in your mind. But imagine this. While that limestone was forming, Grain by grain, the ancestors of modern humans hadn't yet appeared, wouldn't appear for millions of years still. The Earth was shaping the stage long before any actors arrived. Eventually, the seafloor rose. Tectonic forces, the slow grinding of continental plates, lifted sections of limestone above the water. Islands emerged, small ones, Malta and Gozo and Camino, stepping stones between Sicily and North Africa. The stone itself is soft, relatively speaking. Globigerina limestone, it's called, named after the tiny fossils embedded in it. Golden in the sun, easily carved, easily weathered, the perfect material for building, though no one knew that yet. The world was colder then. Not here, perhaps. The Mediterranean stayed mild. But to the north, ice advanced and retreated in great sheets. Glaciers the size of continents. During the ice ages, sea levels dropped dramatically. Water locked up in ice meant less water in the oceans. And when the sea level dropped, Malta wasn't an island anymore. It was connected to Sicily by a land bridge, a peninsula animals could walk across. Elephants did, in fact. Dwarf elephants, smaller than their mainland cousins, evolved in isolation once the waters rose again. Their bones have been found in caves on Malta, evidence of a lost world. Picture it. 7,000 years ago, maybe 8,000. The last ice age is ending. The glaciers are melting. The seas are rising. Slowly, but inexorably. The land bridge to Sicily floods. Malta becomes an island again. The climate warms. Rainfall patterns shift. The landscape is sparse, not lush, not forested, but covered in low scrub, wild grasses, perhaps some stands of trees near freshwater sources. Freshwater is precious here, always has been. There are no rivers on Malta, no lakes, just what rain collects in natural depressions in the limestone and what seeps underground into aquifers. The sky above is the same sky we see now, the same stars, the same constellations wheeling through the seasons. The same sun rising in the east, setting in the west, marking the passage of days into years, into centuries. But the islands are empty, silent, waiting. It's strange to think of a place without people, without voices, without fires or footprints or the sound of tools striking stone. But that's what Malta was for millions of years. Just rock and wind and waves. Just time passing. And then, one day, perhaps on a bright morning, perhaps at dusk, someone arrived. We don't know exactly when. Archaeology gives us approximations, not certainties. But sometime around 5200 BCE, humans reached Malta. They came from Sicily, almost certainly, across maybe 60 miles of open water. That's not far by our standards. But for Neolithic people in dugout canoes or skin boats, it was an expedition, a deliberate choice. They brought things with them: seeds, wheat and barley, animals, sheep and goats, domesticated stock. They weren't explorers stumbling onto empty land. They were farmers, looking for new soil to cultivate, new places to settle. What did they see when they landed? Golden stone rising from blue water, sparse vegetation, rocky terrain, fresh water, if they looked carefully, and space, empty space. No one else here, no competition, just the land itself, waiting to be shaped. They made camps, simple shelters. They explored the island, finding caves where they could store grain, keep animals safe from weather. One cave in particular, Gar Dalam in the southeast, became an important site. We know this because we've found their traces there. Pottery shards, animal bones, the remnants of meals eaten 5,000 years ago, preserved in the dry cave sediments. Evidence of arrival, evidence of settlement, evidence that someone at last had chosen this place to call home. But they didn't build temples. Not yet. Not for another 600 years. That impulse to raise massive stones, to create sacred spaces, hadn't emerged yet. Or maybe it had, somewhere in their minds, in their rituals, but not yet in physical form. For now, they lived simply. They farmed. They raised animals. They made pottery and stone tools. They survived. The islands accepted them. The limestone gave them shelter. The soil, thin as it was, gave them grain. The sea gave them fish. And the sky, well, the sky gave them stars to navigate by, seasons to plant by, patterns to wonder at. Perhaps they looked up at night and asked questions. Perhaps they saw meaning in the movements of celestial bodies. Perhaps they felt something stirring, some need to mark the solstices, to honour the turning of the year, to create something more permanent than wooden huts and clay pots. But for now, they simply lived. generation after generation, tending their fields, raising their children, dying and being buried in the limestone soil, building a quiet continuity that would, eventually, give rise to something extraordinary. The stage was set, the actors had arrived, and deep in the bedrock of the islands, something was waiting to be carved, something that would outlast them all. Imagine the crossing, just for a moment. You're in a boat, not a boat as we'd recognise it, no sails, no motor, just wood lashed together or hide stretched over a frame, maybe hollowed from a single tree trunk. You can feel it flex beneath you as the waves lift and drop. The water is impossibly blue, the sun is bright. You've left Sicily behind, though you can still see it, maybe a dark line on the horizon. Ahead, nothing yet, just open water, just faith that land exists out there, somewhere, because someone told you, or because you saw birds flying that direction and followed them. You're not alone. There are others with you. Family, perhaps. Your community. Children, elders, and cargo. You've brought seeds carefully stored in leather pouches. You've brought a pregnant goat, bleating nervously in the centre of the boat. You've brought your tools. Stone axes, flint blades, scrapers. Everything you need to start again somewhere new. Everything you couldn't leave behind. The crossing takes hours, maybe a full day, depending on currents and wind and how strong your arms are. The sun moves across the sky. Your shoulders ache. The water slaps against the hull, a rhythm that becomes almost meditative. And then, there, a smudge on the horizon. Golden cliffs rising from the sea. Malta. You've made it. This happened. We know it happened because the evidence is there, preserved in the layers of the earth. The earliest phase of human settlement on Malta is called the Gar Dalam phase, named after that cave in the southeast where so much has been found. It dates to around 5200 BCE. That's more than 7,000 years ago. Think about that number. 7,000 years, 70 centuries. The span of time between then and now contains all of recorded history. All the empires, all the wars, all the art and literature and science we think of as civilization. And before all of that, people were already living on Malta. They didn't arrive as conquerors or empire builders. They arrived as farmers. Neolithic people living in the agricultural revolution that had spread across the Mediterranean from the Near East. They knew how to plant crops, how to domesticate animals, how to make pottery and grind grain. They'd been doing it for generations, their ancestors tracing back to the Fertile Crescent where agriculture first began. What did they find when they landed? A landscape shaped by limestone and wind. Caves, lots of caves, carved by water into the soft rock, natural harbours where boats could shelter, soil thin but workable, fresh water, scarce but present, and emptiness. No people, no villages, no one to negotiate with or fight against, just the island itself, neutral and available. They settled near the caves. Gar Dalam became a focal point, a place to store food and seek shelter. The cave deposits tell us what they ate. Emmer wheat, barley, lentils, sheep and goats, certainly. Pigs, cattle perhaps, though large animals are harder to transport and harder to sustain on small islands. Fish from the surrounding sea, shellfish collected from the rocky shores, a diet not so different from other Neolithic communities around the Mediterranean. Their pottery was simple at first, undecorated or lightly incised, functional, bowls for eating, jars for storage. Over time, styles evolved. Patterns appeared, scratched lines, impressed designs, not art for art's sake necessarily, but markers of identity. Ways of saying, this is ours, this is how we do things. They buried their dead. We've found bones. Human remains tucked into caves, sometimes with grave goods, pottery, tools, ornaments made from shell or stone. Evidence of ritual, evidence of care for the deceased, evidence that death mattered, that the transition from life to whatever came after was marked with intention. But still, no temples, no monumental architecture, just small communities, scattered across the islands, living close to the land. Perhaps a few dozen people at first, then a few hundred, growing slowly, learning the rhythms of Malta's climate, when the rains came, when the sun beat down mercilessly, when to plant, when to harvest. Time passed. The Gardalam phase gave way to what archaeologists call the Grey Scorber phase around 4500 BCE. Names, again, borrowed from the sites where certain pottery styles were first identified. The Grey Scorber people, though really they were probably descendants of the Gardalam people, the same communities evolving over centuries, developed more sophisticated ceramics, grey pottery, finely made, sometimes burnished to a soft sheen, and their settlements grew more permanent. Stone huts appeared, not large, small circular or oval structures with walls built from limestone blocks, roofs probably thatched with reeds or grass. Villages, really. Little clusters of homes where extended families lived together, shared ovens and courtyards, worked the surrounding fields in common. We can picture them, maybe, sitting outside their huts in the evening as the sun sets over the sea, grinding grain between stones, mending tools, telling stories to children who've never known any other life. The stars come out. The same stars. Always the same stars. Do they wonder about them? Do they track the movements of Venus or the phases of the moon? Do they notice that the sun rises at a different point on the horizon in summer than in winter? Maybe. Probably. Humans have always watched the sky, have always looked for patterns, for meaning, for signs that the world makes sense. But we can't know what they thought. We can't hear their voices. We can only see what they left behind. Pottery shards, stone tools, the post holes of vanished huts, bones buried with care. The population grew. More villages, more fields, more animals. Evidence of trade begins to appear. Obsidian from the volcanic islands of Pantelleria and Lipari far to the north. Black glass, sharp enough to shave with, treasured for making cutting tools. Someone was travelling. Someone was exchanging goods. Malta wasn't isolated. It was connected, part of a broader network of Neolithic communities across the Mediterranean. And yet, it was still small, still quiet, still a place where nothing monumentally visible had happened. The islands were inhabited, yes, but they weren't remarkable. Not yet. Somewhere around 4100 BCE, another shift, the Red Scorber phase, more pottery evolution, reddish clay, more elaborate decoration. But more than that, something new appears in the archaeological record. Figurines, small clay and stone figures, often depicting women. Some are clearly pregnant, bellies swollen. Some are exaggerated, large hips, full breasts, faceless. Fertility symbols maybe, goddess representations, or just objects of ritual significance whose meaning we'll never fully grasp. They're beautiful though. Even now, holding them in museums, you can feel the care that went into making them. The smooth surfaces, the deliberate proportions. Someone shaped these with intention. Someone valued them. And perhaps, this is when it began. This impulse toward the sacred. This need to create objects and eventually spaces dedicated to something beyond survival. Something beyond the daily work of farming and fishing and staying alive. The spark that would become the temples was kindling. Slowly. Patiently. The islands waited, as they always had, but the silence wouldn't last much longer. There's a strange quality to the centuries just before something monumental happens. A quietness, an ordinariness. Life continuing in patterns that feel permanent, even though they're about to shatter and reshape into something entirely new. On Malta, between about 4500 and 3600 BCE, that's what was happening. Or rather, that's what appeared to be happening. Villages growing, communities establishing themselves, pottery styles evolving through the Grey Scorber and Red Scorber phases, farmers planting and harvesting, children being born, growing up, having children of their own, the rhythm of generations, each one much like the one before. But beneath that surface calm, something was changing, maybe not visibly, maybe not in ways that would show up clearly in the archaeological record, but in the minds and spirits of the people living on these islands. Ideas were forming, questions were being asked, needs were emerging that couldn't be met by a stone hut and a clay bowl. We can see hints of it, those figurines, the Venus figures, some archaeologists call them, though that name imports assumptions from later Greek mythology. Fat ladies, others say, more descriptively if less poetically, female forms, exaggerated and stylized, Some small enough to hold in your palm, some larger, meant to stand in a shrine or special place. They're not portraits. They're not representations of specific women. They're something else. Symbols, perhaps. Icons. Objects that carried meaning beyond their physical form. What did they mean? We don't know. We can guess. We can say fertility cult, or mother goddess worship, or ancestor veneration. But those are our words, our categories. The people who made these figures might not have recognized any of those terms. They had their own language, their own concepts, their own way of understanding what these objects were for, but clearly they were important. Clearly they were worth making, worth preserving, worth placing in contexts that suggest ritual significance. Trade was increasing too. Obsidian still came from Pantelleria and Lipari. Volcanic glass valued for its sharpness, its beauty, maybe even its symbolic properties. But other materials appeared as well. Shells from distant coasts, stone from sources beyond the islands. Evidence that Malta's people were connected to broader networks, exchanging not just goods, but ideas. Imagine sitting in a village on Malta around 4000 BCE. You're part of a farming community, maybe 50 people total. Your days are shaped by the seasons, by the need to plant and tend and harvest. But occasionally, travellers arrive. People from other islands, other coasts. They bring obsidian to trade. They bring stories. They tell you about places where stones are arranged in circles, where the dead are buried in massive tombs, where rituals mark the turning of the year. Do you listen? Of course you do. Do you wonder if you could do something similar here? Maybe not consciously, but the ideas settle, the possibilities germinate. The population was growing. More villages appeared across both Malta and Gozo. The land was being filled, not densely but noticeably. There were people here now, communities with histories, with traditions, with identities distinct from those who'd first arrived 1,000 years earlier. And they were prospering by Neolithic standards. The archaeological evidence suggests no warfare, no fortifications, no mass burials indicating violence or plague, just steady, quiet continuity. Farming communities doing what farming communities do, working the land, raising families, maintaining the cycles that kept everyone fed. But prosperity creates surplus, and surplus creates options. If you're not spending every waking hour just surviving, you can do other things. You can make art, you can conduct rituals, you can build. Around 3800 BCE, something subtle starts to appear. Stone structures that aren't quite houses, small chambers, sometimes built against natural rock formations, niches carved into limestone outcrops, places that feel purposeful but not domestic, shrines maybe, proto-temples, the first tentative experiments in creating dedicated sacred space. They're modest. Nothing like what's coming. But they're different. They represent a shift in thinking, a change in how communities allocate labour and resources. Instead of just building shelter, they're building meaning. The soil of Malta is thin. Farming it is hard work, and over generations, it would only get harder as nutrients depleted and erosion claimed topsoil. But for now, it still gave enough grain to feed everyone. Enough surplus to store against lean times, enough freedom to think beyond mere subsistence. The sky still wheeled overhead. The stars still traced their paths. The sun still rose and set at predictable points on the horizon, shifting slowly through the year. And someone was watching. Someone was noticing. Someone was beginning to think that maybe those celestial patterns mattered, that maybe marking them was important, that maybe creating spaces aligned to solstices or equinoxes was worth the effort. We can't point to a specific moment when the decision was made. There was no council meeting, no decree, no single visionary who announced, "We shall build temples." It doesn't work that way. Change accrues slowly. One generation builds a small shrine. The next generation expands it. The one after that adds refinements. And eventually, without anyone quite intending it, you have something monumental. But the impulse had to start somewhere. The idea had to emerge. And in these quiet centuries before 3600 BCE, on islands where farmers were living lives that looked, on the surface, much like farming lives anywhere in the Neolithic Mediterranean, that idea was taking root. Perhaps it was the figurines that started it. Perhaps the act of creating sacred objects led naturally to the desire for sacred spaces to house them. Perhaps it was the growing sense of community identity, the need to create something permanent that said, "We are here, we matter, we endure." Perhaps it was the astronomical observations, the realization that aligning structures to celestial events could anchor ritual in cosmic time. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps someone just wanted to honor something larger than themselves, to create beauty that would outlast their own brief life, to leave a mark on the world that wasn't just survival, but meaning. We'll never know the motivation. We can only see the result. And the result was about to emerge. Patient centuries of quiet preparation were about to give way to an explosion of monumental building. Stone was about to be carved and raised on a scale that would astonish anyone who witnessed it. The islands were about to be transformed from simple farming communities into something else entirely, a civilization of temple builders, the first great architects of Europe. People who would create structures so enduring, so precisely made that they would still stand 5,000 years later, long after every other trace of their culture had vanished. The silence before the temples was ending. The stones were waiting, and soon, very soon, hands would reach out to shape them. Around 3600 BCE, something remarkable began. On the island of Gozo, Malta's smaller sister to the northwest, people started moving stones. Not small stones, not the kind you could lift with your hands or roll with a partner. Massive stones, blocks of coralline limestone weighing 20, 30, even 50 tons. Stones that required dozens of people working together, coordinating their effort, sustaining their labor over months or years. They were building something that had never been built before. The site is called Gantija now. The name means belonging to the giants in Maltese, given by later inhabitants who couldn't imagine ordinary humans moving such massive blocks. It seemed like the work of giants, of beings with strength beyond the human. And in a way, maybe it was. Not literal giants, of course, but the collective strength of a community working as one. That kind of power can move mountains. Or at least, it can move enough stone to build temples that will stand for 5,000 years. Take a breath here. Let that number settle. 5,000 years. Gantija was already ancient when the first pharaohs ruled Egypt. It was already a ruin, half forgotten when Rome was founded, and it's still there, still standing, still holding its mysteries. The temple, because that's what it is, or what we call it, consists of two connected structures sharing a common outer wall. The facade is extraordinary, massive upright stones, megaliths, some reaching over 5 meters tall. They're not precisely cut. There's no smooth facing, no attempt at perfection, but they fit together well enough, and the sheer mass of them creates an impression of permanence, of weight, of something built to endure. If you could touch one of those stones, and you can actually if you visit, you'd feel the limestone's texture. Rough, pitted, weathered by 50 centuries of rain and wind and sun. Warm if it's daytime, cool in shadow, and if you pressed your palm flat against it and closed your eyes, you might feel something else. A connection, maybe. A thread stretching back through time to the hands that shaped this stone, that levered it upright, that stood back and saw it in place and felt... what? Pride? Relief? Awe at what they'd accomplished? We don't know how they did it, not precisely. No written records explain the process, no diagrams survived, but we can reconstruct some of it through archaeology and experimentation. The limestone was quarried locally. You can still see the extraction sites nearby, depressions in the rock where blocks were cut away. The tools were stone, flint hammers, stone chisels, perhaps wooden wedges driven into cracks and then soaked with water so they'd swell and split the rock. Patient, brutal work. Moving the blocks, that's harder to imagine. Wooden rollers, perhaps, cut from whatever trees grew on the islands then. Sledges, ropes made from plant fibers or animal hide, and people. Dozens of people, pulling, pushing, singing maybe to coordinate their effort, chanting, creating rhythm to match their movements. How long did it take? Months, years, decades. The temples weren't built all at once. They evolved. Sections were added, walls were extended, chambers were refined. Radiocarbon dating suggests construction at Gantija began around 3600 BCE and continued intermittently for centuries. Generations of builders, each adding to what came before. The interior layout is distinctive, a central corridor with chambers opening off to either side, creating a shape that some describe as resembling a shamrock or a female body. 2 lobes at the front, a rounded apse at the back. Was that intentional? Was the shape symbolic? We think so, we suspect so, but we can't be certain. The builders left no explanation. What we do know is that the chambers were used for ritual. We've found evidence: animal bones, pottery shards, stone altars, hearths where fires burned, offerings perhaps, sacrifices, communal meals. The floors are paved with limestone slabs, smoothed by use, by countless feet walking the same paths over and over. And the roof. This is important. The temples were roofed, not with wooden beams, there's no evidence of that, and wood large enough would have been scarce, but with stone. Corbelled roofing, where each course of stones projects slightly inward from the one below until the gap at the top is small enough to be bridged by a single capstone. It's a technique that requires understanding structural forces, weight distribution, balance. It's engineering, even if they didn't call it that. Some of those roof stones are still in place at Gantija. You can stand inside the temple and look up and see them. Massive slabs overhead, tons of stone held in equilibrium, defying gravity for 5,000 years. It's breathtaking. It's humbling. But why? That's the question that haunts every visitor, every archaeologist, every person who stands before these stones. Why invest so much effort? Why allocate so much community labour? Labour that could have gone to farming, to building better houses, to making life easier, into creating these spaces. The only answer that makes sense is that it mattered. Profoundly. Whatever rituals occurred here, whatever beliefs these temples embodied, they were central to the community's identity. Worth the cost, worth the effort, worth the generations of work. Religion, we might say. But that word carries baggage. We think of organised religion, of priests and doctrine and theology. This might have been something simpler, or something more complex. Connection to ancestors, perhaps. Veneration of natural forces, marking the cycles of the agricultural year, ensuring fertility of crops and herds, seeking favour from whatever powers controlled rain and sun and harvest. Or maybe it was about community itself, about creating something together that no individual could create alone, about binding the society through shared effort, shared purpose, shared sacred space. Maybe the building was as important as the finished structure. Maybe the act of raising stones together was itself the ritual. We'll never know for certain. But standing there, standing at Gantija as the sun sets and the golden light washes over the limestone and the shadows lengthen across the ancient floors, you feel the weight of those questions. You feel the presence of something that mattered enormously to people who are gone now, whose names we'll never know, whose voices are silent. The stones remain. Patient, enduring, holding their secrets. And this was just the beginning. Gantija was the first, but it wouldn't be the last. Across Malta and Gozo, more temples would rise, more stones would be raised. The impulse that created Gantija would spread, would evolve, would create a landscape of sacred architecture unmatched anywhere in the Neolithic world. The emergence had begun. The age of temples was dawning, and the islands would never be the same. For thousands of years, the temples were just there. Ruins, stones half buried in soil. Mysterious, yes, but not understood, not dated, not placed in any coherent timeline of human history. The Romans knew about them. Medieval farmers worked fields around them. Arab settlers noted them. British colonial administrators catalogued them, but no one really knew how old they were. Guesses ranged wildly. Some thought they might be Phoenician. Others suggested they were Roman outposts. A few imagined they were more ancient. But how much more ancient? A few hundred years? 1,000? No one suspected the truth. The breakthrough came in the mid-20th century. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the late 1940s by Willard Libby, revolutionized archaeology. For the first time, organic materials could be dated with reasonable precision based on the decay of carbon-14 isotopes. Charcoal from ancient fires, bone from sacrifices, seeds preserved in pottery. All of it became datable. All of it could be placed on a timeline. In the 1960s and 70s, archaeologists began systematically dating Malta's temples. They collected samples from Gantija, from Hagar Kim and Manajdra on the main island, from Tarxian, from the Hypodium. They sent them to labs, they waited for results, and when the results came back, they were astonishing. The dates clustered between 3600 and 2500 BCE. Some samples pushed even earlier, 3800, 3900 BCE for the earliest phases. But the main period of temple building, the era when these massive structures were being erected across the islands, was solidly in the 4th millennium BCE. Let that settle for a moment. 3600 BCE. That's 56 centuries ago. That's older than Stonehenge's iconic stone circle by roughly 1,000 years, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by 500 to 1,000 years, older than the earliest Mesopotamian ziggurats, older than almost any other monumental stone architecture anywhere on Earth. Malta's temples aren't just old. They're among the oldest freestanding stone buildings humanity has ever created. The archaeological community was stunned. Europe, peripheral Europe, island Europe, had been building temples before the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia had raised their monuments. Neolithic farmers, living in small communities without cities, without writing, without metal tools, had created architecture that rivaled or exceeded anything their contemporaries were doing. It challenged assumptions. It still challenges assumptions. We tend to think of civilization as flowing from east to west, from the Fertile Crescent outward. We imagine that monumental architecture requires urban centres, centralised authority, specialised labour forces. But Malta's temples suggest something different. They suggest that the impulse to build sacred spaces, to create enduring monuments, emerged independently in many places. That it doesn't require cities or kings, just communities with shared beliefs and sufficient surplus to allocate labour towards something beyond mere survival. The dates also revealed something else. The temples weren't built all at once. They evolved. Early phases at sites like Skorba and Megar show simpler structures, smaller, less elaborate. Then, around 3600 BCE, there's a surge. Gantija rises. Temples at Hagar Kim and Menajdra follow. Tarxian, the most elaborate of all, comes later, around 3000 BCE. The tradition continued for over 1,000 years, each generation maintaining and adding to what came before. And then it stopped. Around 2500 BCE, temple building ceased. The sites were abandoned. The ritual deposits stopped. The culture that created these monuments vanished, or transformed so radically that it became unrecognizable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, focus on the dates. Focus on what they mean. When the pyramids of Egypt were being built, those iconic structures we think of as the essence of antiquity, Malta's temples were already ancient. When the first pharaohs were consolidating power along the Nile, Malta's temple builders had been practicing their craft for over 1,000 years. When Stonehenge's famous Sarsen Circle was erected, around 2500 BCE, Malta's temple tradition was ending, the last stones being placed, the final rituals performed. This is what makes Malta extraordinary. Not just that the temples are old, but that they're so much older than we expected them to be. That they predate almost everything we use as reference points for ancient civilizations. Standing in the shadow of these stones, knowing their age, changes how you see them. They're not just ruins, they're time machines, connections to a world almost incomprehensibly distant from our own. A world where Europe was wilderness, where civilization was just beginning its long, strange journey, where humans were experimenting with new ways of organizing society, new ways of expressing meaning, new ways of relating to the cosmos. And they succeeded. Whatever the temple builders were trying to do, they succeeded well enough that their creations still stand. Well enough that we can still walk through those chambers, still touch those stones, still feel the echo of whatever mattered so much to them. The carbon dates gave us a timeline. They placed Malta's temples firmly in the Neolithic, in the age of stone tools and farming villages. But they also gave us a mystery. How did this happen here? Why here? What was it about these small Mediterranean islands that sparked such extraordinary architectural ambition? Some believe it was isolation. Cut off from mainland Europe, Malta's communities developed their own unique traditions, their own responses to the challenges of island life. Others suggest it was connection, that trade networks brought ideas and inspiration that local communities adapted in their own way. Maybe it was the limestone itself, easy to quarry, easy to shape, abundant, the perfect material for a culture inclined toward building. Maybe it was the landscape, open, visible, inviting grand gestures of construction. Maybe it was religious fervor, a belief system that demanded monumental expression. Or maybe it was just chance. The right conditions, the right people, the right moment in time. Lightning striking, creativity finding its outlet. We don't know. The dates tell us when, but not why. The carbon samples reveal the timeline, but not the motivation. Science can only take us so far. The rest is silence. The rest is standing before these stones and wondering. And that's enough. That's more than enough. To stand in the presence of something so old, so enduring, and to feel the questions rising, that's what these temples offer. Not answers, questions. Deep, patient, enduring questions. The stones have been asking those questions for 5,000 years. They'll keep asking long after we're gone. Archaeology is patient work, slow work. You don't discover ancient civilizations in a flash of insight. You brush away soil, grain by grain. You sift through dirt looking for fragments. You catalogue pottery shards, measure bone fragments, note the position of every tiny artifact before carefully removing it. You spend days, weeks, months excavating a single square metre of earth. And from that tedious, methodical process, slowly, a picture emerges. At Malta's temples, archaeologists have been digging for over a century, and with each season, with each careful excavation, the world of the temple builders comes into slightly clearer focus. The deposits inside the temples tell stories, animal bones for instance, thousands of them. Carefully analysed, they reveal what was sacrificed, what was eaten, what rituals involved. Sheep and goats mostly, some cattle, pigs. These were domesticated animals, raised by the community, brought to the temples and killed there, perhaps in ceremonies marking important occasions. The bones show butchering marks, evidence that after sacrifice the meat was distributed, consumed. Communal feasting as part of ritual practice. But here's what's interesting. There are no human bones in the temple deposits. None. The temples weren't tombs. They weren't burial grounds. They were places for the living, not the dead. Places where communities gathered to perform rituals, to make offerings, to connect with whatever sacred forces they believed inhabited these spaces. The pottery found in the temples is beautiful, not utilitarian ware, but ceremonial vessels, decorated with incised patterns, spirals, dots, wavy lines, some painted with red ochre, some shaped into unusual forms, bowls with elaborate handles, vessels that seem designed more for display than use. This is special pottery, made for special purposes, brought to the temples as offerings or used in rituals we can only imagine. Stone tools scatter through the deposits. Flint blades, obsidian scrapers, limestone hammers, evidence of the technology available to the builders. No metal, bronze wouldn't arrive in Malta until after the temple period ended. Everything was done with stone, wood, bone. That makes the achievement even more remarkable. They built these massive structures, moved those enormous blocks, carved those intricate decorations, all with Neolithic technology. And the decorations. Oh, the decorations. This is where the temples truly come alive. Because these aren't just functional structures. They're art. They're expressions of creativity and symbolic thought that rival anything produced in the ancient world. Tarxien, in particular, preserves extraordinary carved reliefs. Stone blocks decorated with spirals, single spirals, double spirals, triple spirals flowing into each other in mesmerizing patterns. What did they mean? We don't know. Spirals appear in Neolithic art across Europe, from Malta to Ireland to the Atlantic coast of France. They seem to carry meaning, to symbolize something important. Life cycles, perhaps, death and rebirth, the movement of celestial bodies, water flowing, time spiraling endlessly. Or maybe they were just beautiful. Maybe the temple builders carved spirals because spirals pleased the eye, created rhythm, gave structure to blank stone. Not everything needs symbolic meaning. Sometimes art is just art. But there are other carvings too. Animals, recognizable ones. Bulls clearly depicted with horns and powerful bodies. Sows, some with multiple rows of teats, suggesting fertility, abundance. Goats. These were the animals central to Malta's farming economy, the creatures that sustained life. Seeing them carved in stone suggests veneration, or at least recognition of their importance. And then there are the truly enigmatic carvings, geometric patterns that don't resolve into recognizable forms, blocks covered with pitted holes, dozens or hundreds of small depressions carefully pecked into the surface. Were they symbolic, decorative, functional in some way we can't grasp? The stones don't tell us. They just display the patterns and wait for us to wonder. The walls of some temple chambers were plastered and painted. Traces of red ochre survive in protected corners, hints of what must have been more extensive decoration. Imagine these temples not as bare stone ruins, but as they were, walls glowing with colour, patterns and symbols rendered in ochre and perhaps other pigments that haven't survived, firelight flickering across painted surfaces, shadows dancing, the smell of burning fat from sacrificed animals, the sound of voices chanting or singing in a language no one alive can understand. That's the world emerging from the soil, fragment by fragment, bone by bone, shard by shard. One of the most remarkable finds comes from Tarxian, the lower half of a massive statue. A seated figure, legs rendered in stone, skirt carefully carved. The upper body is missing, broken away in antiquity, but what remains is extraordinary. The figure is enormous. The complete statue would have stood over 2 meters tall. It's a fat lady, the same exaggerated female form seen in smaller figurines, but monumentalized, given weight and presence and permanence in stone. Who did it represent? A goddess? A priestess? An ancestral figure? A symbolic representation of fertility or abundance? We label it with our terms, but we don't know what the builders called it or what it meant to them. We just know they carved it with care and placed it in a prominent position in the temple where it would have been seen by everyone who entered. There are stone altars too, hearths, evidence of fire. These temples weren't cold, empty spaces. They were active, used, central to community life. People came here regularly, brought offerings, performed rituals, lit fires, made sacrifices, shared meals. The temples were meeting places, sacred spaces, centers of meaning in a world where meaning was precious. And throughout all the excavations, across all the temple sites, there's one remarkable absence: weapons. No spear points, no arrowheads meant for warfare, no evidence of fortifications or defensive architecture. The temple culture of Malta seems to have been peaceful, focused inward on ritual and community rather than outward on conflict. That doesn't mean life was idyllic. Survival in any Neolithic community was hard. Infant mortality was high. Disease was common. Harvests could fail. But the archaeological evidence suggests that whatever challenges the temple builders faced, warfare wasn't prominent among them. They invested their energy in building temples, not fortresses, in creating art, not weapons. The soil is still giving up its secrets. Every few years, new excavations reveal new details. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there may be undiscovered chambers, unexplored sections of known temples. DNA analysis of the human bones found in burial sites is beginning to reveal population relationships, migration patterns, genetic connections to other Mediterranean communities. The temple builders are becoming less mysterious, not fully known, never that, but less shadowy, less unknowable. We can see them more clearly now. Farming communities, skilled craftspeople, ritual specialists, artists, astronomers, as we'll see. People who lived fully human lives, births and deaths, joys and sorrows, ordinary days and extraordinary moments, and who built temples. Magnificent, enduring temples that still stand as testimony to their creativity, their devotion, their refusal to be forgotten. The stones preserve what words never could, and the soil, patient and generous, continues to yield fragments of a world long gone but not entirely lost. The temples weren't just buildings. They were calendars, observatories, instruments for tracking time itself. We know this because of the light, because of how the sun moves through these spaces at specific moments of the year, because the builders aligned certain temples, certain chambers to capture solstice sunrise or equinox illumination with precision that couldn't be accidental. They were watching the sky carefully, and they were encoding what they saw into stone. Menidra is the clearest example. This temple complex sits on the southern coast of Malta, facing the sea, positioned on a slope that gives it clear views to the eastern horizon. It's not the largest temple, not the most elaborately decorated, but it's the most astronomically precise. Stand inside the southernmost temple at Mnajdra on the morning of the summer solstice, June 21st, the longest day of the year, and watch what happens. As the sun rises, its first rays enter through the temple's main entrance and strike the edge of a particular megalith inside. The light moves as the sun climbs, illuminating the stone in a way that happens only on this day, a marker, a confirmation. The year has reached its turning point.
Do the same at the winter solstice, December 21st, the shortest day, and the light behaves differently. It enters at a different angle, illuminates different stones, same entrance, different season, different sacred geometry revealed. And at the equinoxes, the spring and autumn moments when day and night are equal, the sunlight penetrates straight through the temple's central axis, illuminating the main chamber with perfect alignment. A moment of balance, a hinge point in the year's cycle. This is not coincidence. This is intentional design. This is evidence that the temple builders understood the sun's movements, tracked them, considered them important enough to encode into their most sacred architecture. Imagine being a farmer on Malta 3,500 years ago. Your survival depends on planting at the right time, harvesting at the right time. Too early, and the seeds rot in cold soil. Too late, and you miss the rains. You need to know when the seasons turn. You need certainty. The temple gives you certainty. The priests, or ritual specialists, or astronomers, or whatever they were, watch the sky. They track the sun's rising point along the horizon as it shifts through the year. They know when it reaches its northernmost point and begins its return. They know when it balances at the midpoint. And when those moments come, the temple confirms it. The light enters just so. The stone glows. The gods have spoken, or the cosmos has aligned, or the pattern continues as it must, and you know it's time to plant, or harvest, or perform the rituals that ensure the cycle continues another year. Hagar Kim, another southern temple, shows similar alignments. The main entrance faces roughly southeast, oriented toward the rising sun at the summer solstice. Inside, certain chambers catch light at specific times. There's a window-like opening, a trilithon, two uprights supporting a horizontal stone that frames the view to the horizon. Through it, at the right time of year, you could observe the sunrise, or perhaps Venus. Some researchers suggest the alignment might track Venus's rising, that bright morning or evening star that ancient peoples across the world considered sacred. The builders didn't leave instructions. They didn't carve explanations into the walls saying, "This temple aligns to the solstice." But the alignments are there, measurable, consistent, significant. And it's not just the light, it's the sound. The acoustic properties of these spaces are remarkable. The corbelled roofing, the stone walls, the specific chamber shapes, they create resonance. Stand in certain spots and speak, and your voice echoes, amplifies, carries through the structure in ways that feel almost uncanny. Chanting would sound extraordinary here. Drumming would resonate. Music, whatever instruments they had, whatever songs they sang, would have filled these spaces with sound that felt larger than human, that seemed to come from the stones themselves. There's a chamber in the hypogum, the underground complex we'll explore more later, called the Oracle Room. The acoustics there are particularly striking. A male voice speaking in a low register creates resonance at specific frequencies that you can feel in your chest, in your bones. It's physical. It's visceral. If you were experiencing that for the first time in the context of ritual, by firelight, it would feel like the gods were speaking, like the earth itself was responding to your voice. The temple builders understood this. They must have. The chamber shape, the ceiling height, the placement of niches, all of it creates the acoustic effect. It's engineered even if they didn't have the mathematics to describe what they were doing. They experimented, they listened, they shaped the stone until it sang. So picture a ritual. Picture the temple at Mnajdra at dawn on the summer solstice. People have gathered, maybe the whole community, or maybe just the ritual specialists and those deemed worthy to attend. They've brought offerings, animals for sacrifice, pottery filled with grain or oil, flowers perhaps. The temple is already ancient. Their grandparents' helped build it. It's been here longer than living memory. The sky lightens in the east. The first edge of the sun appears over the horizon, and as it rises, its light enters the temple. It touches stone. It illuminates the sacred space exactly as it's supposed to, exactly as it has for centuries, exactly as it will continue to do for centuries more. Someone begins to chant, a low rhythmic sound. Others join in. The temple resonates. The sound fills the space, reflects off the walls, seems to grow larger than the voices creating it. The light moves across the stone. The sun climbs. The moment passes. The ritual is complete. The solstice has been marked. The year will continue its cycle. The crops will grow. The community will endure. This happened. We don't know exactly how, but we know it happened. The temples are evidence, the alignments are evidence, the acoustic properties are evidence. People gathered here at these specific times for these specific purposes. They watched the sky and carved its movements into stone. They created spaces where human ritual and cosmic pattern could meet and merge and mean something. The sophistication is astonishing. These were Neolithic farmers. They didn't have writing or metallurgy or cities, but they had observation. They had patience. They had generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through ritual practice that preserved and transmitted what the community knew. And they built temples that still, 5,000 years later, capture the solstice light exactly as intended. That still resonate when you speak or sing. That still function as calendars and observatories and acoustic chambers. The stones remember what they were made to do. Even when the people who made them are forgotten, the stones remember. The light still enters. The seasons still turn. The cosmos still moves through its ancient patterns. And the temples, patient and enduring, continue to mark the moments that mattered most. Among all the artifacts found in Malta's temples and tombs, one stands out. Not for size, it's small, maybe 12 centimeters long. Not for intricacy, though it's beautifully made, but for the feeling it evokes. She's called the Sleeping Lady, found in the Hippogym, the underground burial complex we'll explore soon. She's carved from clay, terracotta, and she depicts a woman lying on her side on a couch or bed, head resting on her hand, body relaxed in natural repose. She wears what looks like a pleated skirt. Her proportions are generous, full hips, rounded body, and her posture. Her posture is perfect. It's the posture of someone sleeping peacefully, or dreaming, or perhaps dead, laid out for burial. When you see her, she's in the National Museum of Archaeology in Valletta now, you feel something. A connection, an intimacy. She's not a goddess radiating power. She's not an abstract symbol. She's human, vulnerable, at rest. And whoever made her 5,000 years ago understood rest, understood the body in repose, understood how to capture that in clay. She's not alone. Malta's temples and burial sites have yielded hundreds of figurines. Most depict female forms. Some are clearly pregnant, bellies swollen with new life. Some are exaggerated, the so-called fat ladies, with massive hips and breasts and thighs, proportions pushed far beyond realistic to emphasize fertility, abundance, generative power. Some are small enough to hold in your palm. Others are larger, meant to stand in shrines or niches. A few are monumental. That massive statue from Tarxian, for instance, the one that would have stood over 2 meters tall. Only the lower half survives, but even in fragments, it's impressive. The skirt carefully carved, the legs substantial, rooted, a presence that would have dominated the temple space. What did these figures mean? The obvious answer, the one that's been repeated in countless books and museum labels, is goddess worship. the mother goddess, divine feminine, fertility cult, a religion centered on female creative power, on birth and regeneration and the cycles of life. And maybe that's right. Maybe these figures do represent a goddess, or multiple goddesses, or aspects of the divine feminine. It fits. Agricultural societies dependent on successful harvests often venerate fertility. The connection between women's bodies and the earth's productivity is ancient, primal, logical. But maybe it's more complicated than that. Maybe these figures represent ancestors, revered women who died and were commemorated in clay and stone. Maybe they're not gods, but grandmothers, matriarchs, keepers of knowledge and ritual. Maybe honoring them was a way of maintaining continuity, of remembering where the community came from. Or maybe they're symbolic rather than representative. Maybe the exaggerated proportions aren't meant to depict real women or even idealized women, but rather the concept of fertility itself. The idea made manifest. Not, this is what a goddess looks like, but this is what abundance feels like when you give it form. Some of the figurines are faceless, deliberately so. The head is there, but no features are carved. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth stone or clay where a face should be. That could mean they're universal. Any woman. Every woman. The sacred feminine as principle rather than person. Or it could mean something else entirely. We're interpreting through our own cultural lenses, our own assumptions about religion and symbolism. The temple builders might not recognize any of our theories. They might have called these figures by a word that has no translation. They might have used them in rituals we can't imagine. But the sleeping lady, she feels different. She feels specific, like a portrait of an individual, not a symbol. Like someone the artist knew, someone they observed sleeping and wanted to preserve that moment of peace. Maybe she was a beloved figure, a respected elder who died and was commemorated. Maybe this is how they buried her, laid out on a couch in the hypogeum, and the figurine is a memorial, a way to keep her present even after death. We found her in a burial context, after all. The hypogeum held the remains of over 7,000 people buried over centuries. And among all those bones, all that ancient death, there's this small clay figure of a woman at rest. It's tender, it's touching. It suggests that whoever made it cared about this woman, or about the idea of rest, or about preserving something beautiful in the face of mortality. There are male figures too, though far fewer. Some clearly depict men. Others are ambiguous, gender unclear, or deliberately obscured. The emphasis on female forms is undeniable, but it's not exclusive. The temple builders recognized both, created both, used both in whatever ritual or symbolic framework guided their spiritual lives, and the range of styles suggests different makers, different traditions, different purposes. Some figurines are sophisticated, carefully modeled, anatomically plausible. Others are crude, simplified, almost abstract. Some were made by skilled artists, others by ordinary people making do with whatever skill they had, which suggests these weren't just elite ritual objects. They were part of everyday religious practice. Anyone could make one. Anyone could offer one. Anyone could participate in whatever system of belief they embodied. Imagine holding one. Imagine being a farmer on Malta 3,000 years before Christ, working your small plot of soil, worried about rain, about pests, about whether the harvest will be enough. And in your home, tucked into a niche in the wall, you have a small clay figure of a full-bodied woman. Maybe you made it yourself. Maybe someone else in your family made it. And when you're anxious, when you need reassurance, you take it out and hold it. You make an offering, a bit of grain, a drop of oil. You speak to it or to whatever it represents. You ask for help, for abundance, for the survival of your children, for the continuity of life, and maybe that helps. Not because the figure has power necessarily, but because the ritual helps. Because doing something feels better than doing nothing. Because connecting to something larger than yourself, even through a small clay object, gives you strength. That's religion, at its most basic. Not grand temples and elaborate theology. Just humans seeking meaning, seeking help, seeking connection to forces beyond their control, and creating objects that facilitate that connection. The sleeping lady sleeps still. In her museum case behind glass, she rests as she has for 5,000 years. Thousands of people see her every year. They pause, they look, they feel something. A thread connecting them to the person who made her, to the person she might represent, to all the humans across all the millennia who've understood rest and loss and the strange comfort of preserving a moment in clay. She's one of Malta's greatest treasures, not because she's valuable in any monetary sense, but because she's human, completely, utterly human, and that humanity survives. It speaks across the centuries. It reminds us that the temple builders, whoever they were, whatever they believed, felt the same things we feel. Loved, grieved, hoped, rested. And sometimes they made beauty out of those feelings, beauty that endures. Not all of Malta's sacred architecture reaches toward the sky. Some of it burrows into the earth, deep into the darkness, into stone and silence and the realm of the dead. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni is unique. There's nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world. It's an underground temple, a labyrinth of chambers and passages carved entirely from the living rock, extending through 3 levels, descending over 10 meters into the limestone bedrock beneath what is now the town of Paola. It was discovered by accident in 1902. Workers were building houses, digging foundations, and their tools broke through the roof of an underground chamber. They'd stumbled into an ancient world that had been sealed and forgotten for millennia. What they'd found would turn out to be one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in the Mediterranean. The hypogeum is old as the temples above ground. Radiocarbon dating places its use between roughly 3600 and 2500 BCE. 1,000 years of continuous use. 1,000 years of bodies being brought here, of the dead being laid to rest in the dark.
Over 7,000 individuals were buried in the hypogeum. 7,000. That's not a family tomb. That's not even a clan. That's a community ossuary. Generations upon generations bringing their dead to this place, placing them in the chambers, adding to the accumulation of bones that eventually filled the lower levels. It was central to the burial practices of the entire society, the place where the dead went, where memory was preserved, where the ancestors gathered. But it's not just a tomb. It's more than that, because the hypogeum mirrors the temples above ground. The same architectural features, the same decorative motifs, the same care and attention to detail. Descend into it. You can visit, though access is strictly limited to preserve the site, and you enter a world carved from stone. The chambers are shaped like the temple chambers above ground. Rounded apses, central corridors with rooms opening to either side. Corbelled ceilings carved to mimic the stone roofing techniques used in the surface temples. But here, it's all carved from the bedrock, removed grain by grain, hollowed out over decades or centuries with stone tools and patience. The scale is astonishing. Thousands upon thousands of hours of labour, removing tons of limestone, creating spaces that feel enclosed and womb-like, protected, secret. Spaces for the dead that echo the spaces for the living. And the decoration. Red ochre painted on the walls and ceilings, spirals, discs, patterns that flow across the carved surfaces, the same symbolic language used in the temples above, the same visual vocabulary, as if to say, this is the same sacred realm, just inverted. The temples reach up, the hypogeum reaches down, but they're connected. They're part of the same system of meaning. There's a chamber on the middle level that's particularly remarkable. The oracle room, We mentioned it before, but experience it for yourself if you can. It's a small chamber, carefully shaped, and when you stand in it and speak in a low voice, particularly if you're a man with a deep voice, the chamber resonates, it amplifies. The sound doesn't just echo, it vibrates. You can feel it in your chest, in your bones. It's uncanny, almost supernatural. Was this intentional? Of course it was. The chamber is shaped precisely to create this effect. Someone understood acoustics well enough to carve a room that would resonate at specific frequencies. And they did it underground, in the dark, with stone tools. Imagine a burial ritual. Imagine bringing a loved one's body here, descending through the passages by torchlight, the flames flickering, shadows dancing on the painted walls, reaching the oracle room, and someone, a priest, a ritual specialist, a family elder, begins to chant, low and rhythmic, and the room responds. The sound grows. It fills the space. It seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the stone itself, from the earth, from the realm of the dead welcoming the newly arrived. That's powerful. That's profound. That's using architecture and natural phenomena to create an experience that transcends the ordinary. That makes ritual feel like communication with forces beyond human understanding. The bodies were laid out in the chambers, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups. Over time, as space filled, older bones were moved to make room for newer burials. The lower level became packed with skeletal remains, layers of bones, skulls and femurs and ribs all mixed together. The anonymous dead, generations whose names are lost but whose presence is still palpable. They buried grave goods, pottery, stone tools, shell ornaments, personal objects that the deceased might need in whatever afterlife they believed in, or objects meant to honor them, or simply things too precious to be discarded when someone died. The deposits tell us that death was marked with care, with ceremony, with material investment that suggests belief in continuity beyond physical death. And they kept coming back for 1,000 years, bringing their dead, performing rituals, maintaining the spaces. The hypogeum wasn't built all at once. It grew. New chambers were added, deeper levels excavated. The community's relationship with this place evolved over centuries, but it remained central, sacred, necessary. What did they believe happened after death? We don't know. Maybe the dead joined the ancestors in some spiritual realm. Maybe they influenced the fortunes of the living. Maybe they were simply honored, remembered, given a proper place to rest. The hypogeum doesn't answer these questions. It just demonstrates that whatever they believed, it was important enough to carve a vast underground complex to accommodate it. Eventually, it ended. Around 2500 BCE, the same time the temples above ground were abandoned, the burials in the hypogeum stopped. The entrance was sealed, perhaps deliberately, perhaps just through natural collapse and accumulation of soil. The chambers filled with sediment, the painted walls were hidden, the bones rested in darkness. For 4,000 years it was forgotten, until 1902, until workers with shovels broke through and light entered those chambers for the first time in millennia. And we rediscovered what the temple builders had created, a mirror world beneath the surface, a temple for the dead as elaborate as the temples for the living. The hypogeum still exists, protected now, studied, preserved. You can descend into it, walk through those carved passages, see the painted spirals, stand in the oracle room and hear how your voice resonates. You can touch, gently, carefully, the stone that was carved 5,000 years ago by people whose names we'll never know. And you can feel it. The weight of all those deaths, all those burials, all that grief and honor and continuity. 7,000 people laid to rest here. 7,000 lives lived and ended and remembered through the simple act of bringing the body to this place, to the stone, to the darkness, to the ancestors. The hypogeum is a reminder that the temple builders weren't just looking up at the stars, tracking the sun, building toward the sky. They were also looking down, into the earth, into the foundation of things, into the darkness where all lives eventually go. And they made that darkness sacred too. They carved it into something beautiful, something worthy of the dead, something that would endure. And it has. Against all odds, despite being forgotten, despite being rediscovered by accident, despite everything, it endures. The carved chambers, the painted spirals, the silent witness to thousands of years of human death and human devotion. The stone remembers. Down in the darkness, away from the sun, the stone still remembers. Between the rituals and the monuments, between the solstice ceremonies and the burials in the hypogeum, there was ordinary life. Days that followed patterns, work that needed doing, meals to prepare, children to raise, the unglamorous necessary rhythms that sustain any community. What did a typical day look like for someone living on Malta during the temple building era? We can piece together fragments from archaeology, from the tools they left behind, from the animal bones and plant remains preserved in ancient deposits, from the layout of their villages and the evidence of their labour. Most people were farmers. That's the foundation. Malta's temple culture was agricultural, dependent on crops and livestock for survival. The soil was thin, rocky, challenging, but it was workable. Emmer wheat and barley were the staple grains, planted in autumn after the first rains, harvested in late spring before the summer heat became too intense. Lentils and beans added variety to the diet, provided protein. These were crops that the community had been growing for generations, seeds passed down from the original settlers who'd arrived from Sicily. The work was hard, breaking soil with stone hoes and wooden digging sticks, clearing stones, and there were always stones, limestone fragments working their way to the surface, planting by hand, weeding, praying for rain, but not too much rain, watching the sky, watching the crops, hoping. Harvest was communal. It had to be. Grain needed to be cut quickly once ripe, before birds or weather destroyed it. Families worked together. Villages worked together, moving through the fields with flint-bladed sickles. The grain was bundled, carried to communal threshing floors where it was beaten or trampled to separate the seeds from the chaff. Then winnowing, tossing the grain in the air so the wind carried away the lighter chaff while the heavier seeds fell back down. Simple, effective, exhausting. The harvest determined everything. A good harvest meant food for the year, seed grain for next year's planting, surplus that could be stored, traded, offered to the temples. A bad harvest meant hunger, rationing, difficult choices about whether to eat the seed grain or save it for planting. The margin between sufficiency and disaster was thin. Animals grazed on land too poor for crops, sheep and goats mostly, hardy animals that could survive on sparse vegetation. They provided milk, meat, wool, hide. Cattle were fewer, harder to maintain, requiring better grazing, but valuable. A family with cattle had wealth, status. Pigs were raised too, feeding on scraps and roots, converting waste into meat. Imagine a village on Malta around 3000 BCE. Maybe 20 families, 100 people total, stone huts clustered together for mutual protection and community. Each hut is small, perhaps 4 or 5 meters across, 1 or 2 rooms, walls built from limestone blocks, roof thatched with reeds or grass gathered from marshy areas, a central hearth for cooking and warmth during the mild but sometimes damp winters. Morning begins before sunrise. The women, though this is speculation, a division of labour we assume but can't prove, rise first. They kindle the fire from embers kept alive overnight, mix grain with water to make porridge or flatbreads, perhaps add some dried fruit, some herbs, whatever's available. The smell of cooking smoke drifts through the village. One by one, families wake. The stone remembers. Down in the darkness, away from the sun, the stone still remembers. Between the rituals and the monuments, between the solstice ceremonies and the burials in the hypogeum, there was ordinary life, days that followed patterns, work that needed doing, meals to prepare, children to raise, the unglamorous, necessary rhythms that sustain any community. What did a typical day look like for someone living on Malta during the temple building era? We can piece together fragments from archaeology, from the tools they left behind, from the animal bones and plant remains preserved in ancient deposits, from the layout of their villages and the evidence of their labour. The men gather tools, hoes, sickles, axes if there's wood to cut or clear. They head to the fields. The women might join them, or they might stay closer to the village, tending animals, processing grain, making pottery, weaving textiles on simple looms. Children help where they can, watching sheep, gathering firewood, learning the skills they'll need as adults. The work continues through the morning. Around midday, when the sun is high and hot, there's a pause. A simple meal, bread, perhaps some cheese made from sheep or goat milk, water, rest in the shade, then back to work until the light begins to fail. Evenings are communal. Families gather, meals are shared. There's time for repair work, for making tools, for storytelling. The village is small enough that everyone knows everyone. Children play. Elders sit and talk and pass on knowledge. Skills are taught through observation and practice. How to knap flint into sharp blades. How to form clay into useful vessels. How to identify edible plants. How to predict weather patterns. And there are the temples. Always the temples. Visible from the village. Present in the landscape. On certain days, solstices, equinoxes, perhaps at new or full moons, perhaps at harvest or planting times, the community goes to the temple, brings offerings, participates in rituals, connects with the sacred spaces their ancestors built and they maintain. Life expectancy was short, maybe 35 or 40 years on average. Many children didn't survive infancy. Women died in childbirth. Injuries from accidents or hard labour could turn fatal without modern medicine. Disease was common. Dental health was poor. Grinding grain with stone tools left grit in the flour that wore down teeth. But life wasn't all hardship. There was community. There was shared purpose. There was art and music and dance, almost certainly. We've found bone flutes, percussion instruments. People have always made music, always danced. Always found ways to celebrate, to mark important moments, to create joy even in difficult circumstances. And there was meaning. The temples provided that. The rituals provided that. The sense of connection to ancestors, to the land, to the cosmos. The knowledge that when you died you'd be brought to the hippogrium, laid with your people, joining the generations that came before. The pace of life was slow. Seasons turned, years passed, generations lived and died. The temples grew more elaborate, more stones were added, more carvings appeared. The culture refined itself, deepened its traditions, maintained continuity, but nothing lasts forever. Even while daily life continued its patterns, while farmers tended their fields and raised their families and brought offerings to the temples, forces were at work that would eventually end it all. Environmental pressures, climate shifts, soil depletion from centuries of farming, maybe social tensions we can't detect from the archaeological record. The golden age of Malta's temple culture, the peak of building activity, of artistic achievement, of population and prosperity, lasted perhaps 6 or 7 centuries, from around 3600 to 2900 BCE. That's longer than many empires, longer than most civilizations' periods of greatness. A remarkable run. But already, by 2900 BCE, there are signs of change. Fewer new temples being built, less elaborate offerings, subtle shifts in pottery styles that suggest cultural change, perhaps new influences arriving from overseas. The daily life continued, but underneath, the foundations were shifting. The world that had given birth to the temples was beginning to transform into something else. Something that would have less use for massive stone monuments, for astronomical alignments, for the particular vision of the sacred that had animated Malta's temple builders for 1,000 years. The stone would remain, the temples would stand, abandoned but enduring. But the life, the ordinary, daily human life that gave those temples meaning, that was beginning to fade, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but inevitably. Take a breath. The story is shifting. We've seen the temples rise and flourish. Now we'll see what lies hidden within them, what meanings they carried, what connections they made between earth and sky, human and cosmos, stone and starlight. The mystery deepens, and the stones, patient as always, wait to reveal their secrets. Look closely at the stones, not at the temples themselves, not at the massive uprights or the corbelled roofs, but at the surfaces, at the decorative panels that survived 5,000 years of weather and neglect. Look at what the builders carved there. Spirals. Everywhere, spirals. Single spirals coiling inward to a central point. Double spirals flowing into each other like waves. Triple spirals radiating from a common centre. Spirals carved with such care, such precision, that you can still trace their curves with your finger today, feeling the grooves worn into the limestone by patient hands working with stone tools. What did they mean? That's the question that haunts everyone who studies these carvings. Because spirals aren't random decoration, they appear too often, too deliberately, in too many contexts across too many temples. They meant something, they carried significance. They were, in some sense we can't fully grasp, sacred. The most elaborate spiral carvings are at Tarxian. There's a stone block there, just one among many, but this one is extraordinary, covered with interlocking spirals that flow across the surface in a mesmerizing pattern. No straight lines, no geometric rigidity, just curves, organic, flowing, almost hypnotic if you stare at them long enough. The craftsperson who made this spent hours, probably days, pecking and grinding with stone tools to create these patterns. That's dedication. That's reverence for the design itself. Spirals appear in Neolithic art across Europe, not just Malta. You find them carved into the passage tombs of Ireland. Newgrange has spectacular examples, spirals at the entrance and throughout the inner chambers. You find them in Brittany at Gavrini's, where massive stones are covered with flowing spiral patterns. You find them on pottery, on standing stones, on monuments from Scotland to the Mediterranean. So it's not unique to Malta. It's part of a broader symbolic language, a vocabulary of sacred forms that Neolithic people across Europe somehow shared or independently developed. But what did it mean to them? We can speculate. We have speculated. For decades, archaeologists and anthropologists and mystics and artists have offered interpretations. Maybe spirals represent the cycle of life and death, the inward journey to the center, death, burial, dissolution, the outward journey from the center, birth, emergence, renewal. Life spiraling through its phases, always returning, but never quite the same. Maybe they represent water. Spirals appear in nature when water drains, when it swirls. And water is life in an agricultural society, rain spiraling down from clouds, rivers spiraling across the landscape, the cyclical nature of the hydrological cycle, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, endlessly repeating. Maybe they represent the sun's path. If you track the sun's rising point on the horizon through the year, it moves, north to south, south to north, tracing an arc. And if you map that over years, over decades, you see patterns, cycles within cycles, spirals perhaps if you're thinking in those terms. Maybe they represent time itself, not linear time, the kind we think of, past, present, future, in a straight line, but cyclical time. The seasons returning, generations repeating, the sense that everything that happens has happened before and will happen again. Time as a spiral, moving forward but also circling back. Or maybe they were just beautiful. Maybe the temple builders carved spirals for the same reason humans have always made patterns, because patterns please us. Because creating order from chaos, finding form in stone, making something beautiful in a harsh world is itself meaningful. Not everything needs symbolic interpretation. Sometimes art is just art. But the spirals at Malta feel deliberate. They feel chosen. They appear in ritual contexts. Temples, tombs, sacred objects. They're paired with other symbols. Pitted holes arranged in patterns, geometric designs, animal representations. They're part of a system of meaning, even if we can't decode it. There are other carvings too, not spirals, but equally enigmatic. Blocks covered with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small holes pecked into the surface. What are they? Tallies of some kind? Records? Symbolic representations of stars? Offerings? Each hole representing a prayer or sacrifice? We don't know. The stones don't explain themselves. And the animals? Cattle and goats and pigs carved in relief, sometimes quite naturalistically. These were the animals central to survival, to the agricultural economy. Seeing them represented in stone suggests they had meaning beyond mere utility. Perhaps they were sacred. Perhaps sacrificing them was a way of offering the most valuable thing you had. Perhaps carving them in temples was a form of prayer for healthy herds, for fertility, for continuation of the flocks that sustained the community. There's a particular carving at Tarxian that's remarkable, a sow with multiple rows of teats, exaggerated to emphasize her capacity for nurturing multiple offspring. Fertility made manifest. Abundance carved in stone. It's both realistic and symbolic. You can recognize it as a pig, but it's also clearly more than just a pig. It's an idea, a hope, a prayer in stone form. The geometry of the temples themselves carries meaning too. The layouts aren't random. They follow patterns. Most temples have a similar basic structure: an entrance facing roughly southeast, a central corridor, chambers opening to either side, apses rounded like lobes. The shape is often described as resembling a clover leaf, or, more provocatively, a female body. 2 chambers like breasts, an apse like a womb. Is that intentional? Were the temples designed to represent the body of a goddess? The generative feminine form writ large in stone? It fits with the fat lady figurines, with the emphasis on female forms in the art. It makes symbolic sense in a culture that might have venerated fertility above all. But maybe we're seeing what we want to see. Maybe the layout is simply practical, the most efficient way to create multiple chambers with corbelled roofing. Maybe the resemblance to a body is coincidental, and the builders would be baffled by our interpretation. The truth is, we're looking at these symbols across a vast gulf of time and cultural difference. We don't have their language. We don't know their myths, their stories, their explanations. We just have the symbols themselves, silent, enigmatic, beautiful. And that's enough, in a way, because the not knowing creates space for wonder, for imagination, for each generation to look at these spirals and see something different, something relevant to their own questions and concerns. The temple builders left us a language we can't speak, but we can appreciate its beauty. We can trace the spirals with our fingers and our eyes. We can stand in the temples and feel the weight of accumulated meaning, even if we can't articulate what that meaning is. The spirals continue their curves. The pitted stones hold their patterns. The carved animals watch with stone eyes. And 5,000 years after they were made, they still provoke questions, still inspire wonder, still connect us, however tenuously, to the people who made them. Perhaps that was the point all along. Not to communicate specific information, but to create something that would endure, something that would outlast language and memory and explanation, something that would still be here, still beautiful, still mysterious, long after the builders themselves had become dust. If so, they succeeded. The sacred geometry remains, hidden in plain sight, waiting for anyone who takes the time to look, to wonder, to imagine what it might have meant to people who saw meaning in spirals and stars and stone. The mystery is the meaning, and the meaning, perhaps, is the mystery. Here's what they didn't have: bronze, iron, copper, any metal at all, except perhaps small amounts acquired through trade and used as ornaments, not tools. No metal axes or saws, no metal chisels or hammers, no wheels, no draft animals. The islands were too small to support horses or oxen for heavy labour. No pulleys or cranes or any of the mechanical advantages we associate with ancient engineering. Here's what they did have: stone tools, wood, rope made from plant fibres, human muscle, patience. And somehow, with just those things, they built monuments that still stand 5,000 years later. How? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a genuine puzzle that archaeologists and engineers have been trying to solve for decades. Because when you stand in front of a 50-ton stone at Gantija, when you look up at megaliths standing 5 meters tall, when you enter chambers roofed with massive corbelled stones, the question is unavoidable. How did they do this? Let's start with quarrying. The limestone is relatively soft. Globigerina limestone formed from the compressed shells of tiny marine organisms. You can scratch it with a harder stone. You can carve it with effort. But quarrying massive blocks from bedrock is still an enormous undertaking. They probably used the natural weaknesses in the stone. Limestone has bedding planes, natural layers where it's more likely to split. Find those planes and you can work with them. Drive wooden wedges into natural cracks. Soak the wedges with water so they expand. The expansion creates force, widens the crack, eventually splits the rock. It takes time. But time is something Neolithic communities had. Or use fire. Heat the stone surface with fire, then douse it with cold water. The rapid temperature change causes thermal shock, creates fractures. Do this repeatedly, carefully, and you can weaken the stone enough to break off large pieces. Archaeological experiments have confirmed this works, though it's labour-intensive and imprecise. Once you have a block separated from the bedrock, you need to move it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because these blocks are massive. Some weigh 10 tons, 20 tons. The largest at Gantija might be 50 tons or more, and they were moved somehow from the quarry to the temple site. No wheels, so you can't use carts, but you can use wooden rollers. Cut trees, and there were trees on Malta then, more than today, into logs. Place them under the stone block. The block sits on the logs, and as you push or pull, it rolls forward. As rollers emerge from behind, you pick them up and place them in front. Slow, inefficient, but it works. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that even very heavy stones can be moved this way with enough people providing muscle power, or use sledges. Lash wood into a flat platform, place the stone on it, and drag it across the ground. On dry limestone rock, that's difficult, but wet the ground or lay down a track of smaller stones or wood, and friction decreases. Still enormous work, still requires dozens of people pulling on ropes, but possible. How do you make rope strong enough? Plant fibers, flax, hemp, grasses woven and twisted into cord. Layer cords together into thicker rope. It won't last long under stress. Organic materials degrade, but it doesn't need to last forever, just long enough to move the stone. Then make new rope for the next stone. Getting the stones upright is another challenge. You can't just lift a 20-ton block, but you can lever it. Dig a pit where you want the stone to stand. Tilt the stone into the pit so one end drops down. Then the stone is at an angle, partially upright. Use levers, long wooden poles under the raised end. Multiple people pushing down on the levers can lift the stone incrementally. Pack smaller stones and earth under the raised end to support it. Lift again, pack again. Gradually work the stone more and more upright until it's vertical and the pit can be filled to hold it in place. It sounds simple when described step by step, but the reality is brutal. The physical effort, the coordination required, the risk. If a stone slips while being raised, it could crush people. The patience needed to work incrementally, lifting the stone centimetre by centimetre over hours or days. And yet they did it. Not once, but hundreds of times. Every upright stone in every temple represents this process. Human effort, human ingenuity, human determination to create something that mattered enough to justify the cost. The corbelled roofing is equally impressive from an engineering standpoint. To create a corbelled arch or dome, you build up courses of stone, each one projecting slightly inward from the one below. The weight of the upper stones keeps the lower ones in place through compression. No mortar needed. The stones are shaped and fitted carefully enough that gravity holds them. But you need to understand the principles. You need to know how far each stone can project without the whole structure collapsing. Too far, and it becomes unstable. Not far enough, and you can't close the gap at the top. The temple builders clearly understood this. They built corbelled roofs that have survived 5,000 years of earthquakes and weather. That's not luck, that's knowledge. Where did that knowledge come from? Trial and error, almost certainly. Generations of experimentation. Small structures first, learning the principles, then larger ones. Failures along the way, structures that collapsed, teaching hard lessons, success that could be replicated and improved upon. Knowledge passed down through apprenticeship, through oral tradition, through watching and learning and practicing. They didn't have written manuals. They didn't have mathematical formulas. They didn't have engineers with degrees. They had craftspeople who learned through doing, who understood their materials intimately because they worked with them every day, who could look at a block of stone and know, instinctively, whether it would work for a particular purpose. That's a kind of knowledge our technological society has largely lost. We've replaced it with mathematics and machinery. We can calculate load-bearing capacity, but we've lost the feel for stone. The temple builders had that feel. They knew limestone the way a potter knows clay or a carpenter knows wood. And they shared knowledge. The similarity of temple structures across Malta suggests a common tradition. Builders working at different sites, using the same techniques, the same architectural forms. Perhaps there were master builders who travelled, overseeing construction at multiple sites. Perhaps there were training systems, ways of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. We see the results, the temples themselves, but the social structures that made them possible are invisible to us now. Some people don't accept the conventional explanations. They look at the temples and insist that primitive people couldn't have built them. There must have been help. Advanced technology, lost civilizations, ancient astronauts, something. But that's selling the temple builders short. Humans are capable of extraordinary things with simple tools if we're motivated, organized, and willing to invest the time. The temples are proof of that. They're monuments to human capability, human creativity, human persistence. There's no mystery in the sense of supernatural intervention. The mystery is in the motivation. Why did they build these temples? What belief system inspired generations of people to dedicate enormous amounts of labor to creating sacred spaces? That's the real question, and that's the mystery that stone and archaeology can't fully answer. The engineering is impressive, the effort is staggering, but the temples stand because people believed they should stand, because a community decided that creating these spaces mattered more than the cost, because somehow, across generations, that belief was sustained. If this brought you peace, like for more journeys like this one, the stones don't tell us why. They just demonstrate that it was done, that it was possible, that humans 5,000 years ago had the knowledge, the skill, and the determination to move mountains of stone and shape them into temples that would outlast empires. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the fact of the temple's existence is itself the answer. We build what matters to us. And to the temple builders of Malta, these sacred spaces mattered enough to justify everything they cost. The stones stand, the engineering endures, and the mystery of motivation remains, hidden in the silence between the stones. Nothing lasts forever. Not civilizations, not beliefs, not even temples built to endure through eternity. Around 2500 BCE, something changed. The archaeological record shows it clearly, though the reasons remain debated, uncertain, wrapped in the same silence that shrouds so much of Malta's prehistoric past. The temples were abandoned, not all at once perhaps, not in a single catastrophic moment. But gradually, over a generation or two, the rituals stopped, the offerings ceased, the fires that had burned in the hearths for centuries went out and were not rekindled. The chambers that had echoed with chanting fell silent. The alignments to solstice sunrise were no longer observed. The knowledge of what the spirals meant, what the fat ladies represented, what songs were sung in the oracle room, all of it faded into memory and then beyond memory into nothing. The temple-building tradition that had flourished for over 1,000 years came to an end, and we don't know exactly why. There are clues, signs in the earth and stones that suggest possibilities. The environment, for one. Malta's soil was never abundant. Farming it for generations would have depleted nutrients, reduced yields, erosion would have washed topsoil into the sea. Deforestation, cutting trees for rollers and construction and firewood, would have left the landscape more barren, less able to support agriculture. There's evidence of climate change too, not dramatic but significant. A shift toward drier conditions in the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Less rainfall, longer droughts. For an island community dependent on rain-fed agriculture, on fresh water collected in natural limestone depressions, that would be devastating. Wells might run dry, crops might fail more frequently, hunger might become chronic rather than occasional. When food becomes scarce, when the basic necessities of survival are threatened, religious systems come under strain. If the temples promised fertility and abundance, if rituals were supposed to ensure good harvests and healthy herds, and those promises weren't being kept, what then? Faith can sustain people through temporary hardship, but if conditions worsen over decades, if each generation is worse off than the last, eventually belief erodes. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe the temple religion simply failed to deliver what the community needed, and gradually people stopped participating, stopped bringing offerings, stopped investing labor in maintaining structures that no longer seemed effective. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe the population declined. Fewer people means less labor available for temple maintenance. Fewer priests or ritual specialists. Fewer participants in ceremonies. The tradition requires continuity. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, rituals performed regularly. Break that chain, and it's difficult to restore. Once a generation grows up without participating in the old rituals, they might not see the point. They might develop new practices, new beliefs. The temples become relics of their grandparents' time, no longer relevant to current needs. There's no evidence of invasion or warfare, no burnt layers in the archaeological deposits, no mass graves, no weapons suddenly appearing in the record. Whatever ended the temple culture, it wasn't violent conquest. It was something slower, something internal, environmental collapse or cultural transformation, or some combination of both. Around the same time, the temples fell silent. New people arrived. We can see them in the archaeological record, a different material culture. The Tarxian cemetery phase, it's called, because the most visible evidence comes from cremation burials deposited in the abandoned temple at Tarxian. These new arrivals practiced cremation, not burial. They made different pottery styles. They had different ways of doing things. Were they invaders, migrants, or just the descendants of the temple builders, culturally transformed? It's hard to say. There may have been some population continuity. The genetic record suggests mixing rather than complete replacement. But the cultural break is clear. The temple tradition ended. Whatever replaced it left far fewer traces. Simpler material culture, smaller settlements, no monumental architecture. Malta during the Bronze Age was less remarkable than Malta during the temple period. Just another small island in the Mediterranean, home to farming communities and traders, but nothing exceptional. The extraordinary moment had passed. Some of the temples were partially dismantled, stones taken for other uses. Some became animal pens or storage areas, utilitarian purposes for what had once been sacred spaces. Some were just abandoned and slowly buried under accumulating soil, vegetation growing over them, turning them into mysterious mounds that later inhabitants would attribute to giants because who else could have moved such stones? The knowledge died. Within a few generations, probably within a century, no one remembered who built the temples or why. No one knew the meanings of the spirals. No one could read the architectural symbolism. The temples became mysteries even to the people living nearby. The Romans, who eventually controlled Malta, knew about the ruins but not their origins. Medieval and Arab inhabitants noted them but didn't understand them. They were just old stones, curiosities, evidence of some vanished past, but the details were lost. Think about that. Think about how quickly extraordinary can become ordinary, can become forgotten. A tradition maintained for 1,000 years ended and was forgotten in less than 100. All that accumulated knowledge, all those generations of craftspeople and priests and ritual specialists, all the astronomy and engineering and artistic achievement, gone, preserved only in the silent stones themselves. It's sobering. It's a reminder of how fragile cultural continuity is, how dependent on transmission, on teaching, on communities maintaining their practices across generations. Break the chain, and it's lost, maybe forever, but not entirely, because the stones remain. The temples weren't completely destroyed. They endured through neglect and repurposing and burial, and eventually, in the modern era, they would be rediscovered, excavated, studied, honored again, if not in the way their builders intended. The silence after the temples fell isn't absolute silence. It's more like a pause, a gap in the conversation. The builders spoke in stone, creating monuments that said, "We were here, we believed, we created." And then they fell silent, and for thousands of years, no one could hear what the stones were saying. But now we can, not perfectly, not completely, but we can stand in those temples, touch those stones, trace those spirals, and hear echoes of what once was. The conversation resumes across an immense gulf of time. The temples speak again, even if we don't understand every word. The ending wasn't an ending then, just a transformation. The temple builders vanished, but their creations endured. The beliefs faded, but the stones remained. The voices fell silent, but the message survived, encoded in architecture and art, waiting patiently for anyone willing to listen. And we are listening. 5,000 years later, we're still trying to hear what they were saying, still wondering what the spirals meant, still amazed that they built these structures with nothing but stone tools and human determination, still feeling the weight of their achievement and the sadness of their disappearance. The temples fell silent, but they never stopped speaking. They just needed someone to remember how to hear. When the temples fell silent, Malta didn't become empty. Life continued. People still farmed the thin soil, still raised sheep and goats, still lived and died on these small islands. But they were different people, or maybe the same people, transformed. The archaeological record shifts, and we see something new emerging from what came before. Around 2500 BCE, as the last temple rituals were being performed, as the final stones were being placed, or the old structures were beginning their long abandonment, a new cultural phase appears. It's called the Tarxian Cemetery phase, named, as so many archaeological periods are, after the site where it was first identified. And at Tarxien, in the Eastern Temple complex, something striking happened. The temple was repurposed, used for burials, but not the kind of burials practiced during the temple period. Cremations, bodies burned to ash and bone fragments, then placed in large ceramic urns. The urns were deposited in the temple chambers, sometimes dozens of them. Different pottery styles, different burial practices, different ways of relating to death and the sacred. Who were these people? That's the question. That's the mystery we're still trying to untangle. Some scholars believe they were newcomers, migrants from Sicily or southern Italy, arriving by boat and settling on islands where the old temple culture had already collapsed or was collapsing. They brought new technologies, early metalworking, bronze objects, though still rare and valuable. They brought new pottery traditions. They brought cremation instead of burial. And they found temples, already ancient, already mysterious, and used them for their own purposes, without understanding what they'd originally been for. Others suggest continuity. Perhaps these weren't invaders, but descendants. The same communities transformed by environmental pressures, by contact with other Mediterranean cultures, by the simple passage of generations. Cultural change doesn't require population replacement. Beliefs shift, practices evolve. What mattered to one generation might seem irrelevant to the next. Maybe the temple builders' grandchildren simply stopped maintaining the old traditions and adopted new ones. The genetic evidence, what we have of it, is ambiguous. DNA extracted from Bronze Age burials shows both continuity and change. Some lineages persist from the Neolithic temple period. Others are new, suggesting immigration. So probably the truth is mixed. Some new people arrived, some old families remained. They intermarried, blended, created something new that was neither purely immigrant nor purely indigenous. But the cultural break is undeniable. The temple tradition ended. The knowledge that went with it, how to align structures to solstice sunrise, what the spirals meant, what rituals were performed in the corbelled chambers, all of that vanished. Within a century, maybe less, no one remembered. It's astonishing how quickly it happened. A tradition maintained for over 1,000 years, abandoned and forgotten in a single lifetime. The last person who remembered the old rituals died. Maybe they tried to teach the younger generation. Maybe the young weren't interested. Maybe environmental collapse was so severe that survival took precedence over tradition. Whatever the reason, the chain broke. The temples became ruins, just old stones, structures that clearly weren't natural, that obviously required enormous effort to build, but whose purpose was lost. The Bronze Age inhabitants of Malta looked at them with the same puzzlement we do. They didn't know who built them or why. The temples were already ancient mysteries. Some were repurposed, as we've seen, used for burials, for storage, for animal pens. Stone blocks were sometimes removed and reused in other structures. Practical recycling. Why cut new stone when perfectly good blocks are just sitting there in an abandoned temple? The Bronze Age settlers weren't archaeologists. They weren't concerned with preservation. They used what was available. Other temples were simply left, slowly buried under accumulating soil, vegetation growing over them, wind and rain eroding the exposed surfaces, time doing what time does, wearing down, covering over, obscuring. The temples became bumps in the landscape, anomalous mounds, places where the ground was rocky, where digging revealed worked stone instead of bedrock, and stories developed, myths, explanations, because humans need explanations. When you encounter massive stones that clearly didn't get there naturally, you have to explain them somehow. And if you don't know the true explanation, you invent one. Giants. That became the explanation. The temples were built by giants, beings of superhuman strength who could move stones no ordinary person could budge. Hence Gantija, belonging to the giants. Hence similar legends attached to megalithic sites across Europe. From Malta to Stonehenge to the dolmens of Brittany, people attributed ancient stone structures to giants or gods or other supernatural beings because the alternative, that ordinary humans built them with stone tools and muscle power, seemed implausible. The legends served a purpose. They preserved a sense that something important happened here, even if the details were lost. They marked these places as special, worthy of notice, different from ordinary landscape. The stories weren't accurate, but they kept memory alive in a form, a distorted form, a mythologized form, but better than complete forgetting. Through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, through Phoenician and Carthaginian influence in the Mediterranean, through the rise of classical Greek culture, Malta remained inhabited, traded with other islands and mainland powers, participated in the broader Mediterranean world, but the temples were just old ruins, background elements of the landscape. No one knew their age or origin. The Romans took control of Malta around 218 BCE. They catalogued it as part of their empire, noted its harbours and resources and strategic position. Roman writers occasionally mention the mysterious ancient structures, but they didn't know who built them either, just that they were old, very old, from some vanished people. Medieval Malta, under various rulers, Byzantine, Arab, Norman, continued the pattern. The temples existed, people saw them, but their origins were shrouded in mystery and legend. Some thought they might be Phoenician, others imagined they were natural rock formations, carved by wind and water into shapes that resembled architecture. Still others returned to the giant theory. What else could explain such massive stones? It's humbling, in a way. How thoroughly a culture can vanish. The temple builders invested everything in creating permanent monuments. They built in stone specifically because stone endures. They wanted to leave a mark, to be remembered, and they were forgotten anyway, not immediately, but quickly enough. The monuments remained, but the meaning disappeared. Only in the modern era, with the development of archaeology as a systematic discipline, with radiocarbon dating and comparative analysis and careful excavation, have we begun to recover fragments of the truth, to understand that the temples are Neolithic, older than the pyramids, built by farming communities over a 1,000-year period, to recognize the astronomical alignments, to see the sophistication of the engineering, to appreciate the artistic achievement. But even now, with all our scientific tools, we don't fully understand. We can date the temples, we can describe them, we can marvel at them, but we can't fully know what they meant to the people who built them. We're still separated by that vast gulf of time and cultural difference. The Bronze Age arrivals stood closer in time to the temple builders than we do. Only a few centuries separated them instead of 5,000 years, and yet they'd already forgotten, already lost the knowledge, already turned history into myth. Perhaps that's the lesson. Perhaps continuity is rarer than we think. Perhaps every generation, every culture has to consciously choose to preserve knowledge, or it vanishes. Writing helps. It fixes information in a form that can survive even if oral tradition fails. But the temple builders didn't have writing. They had only stone and memory. The stone endured. The memory didn't. We're luckier. We have their stones and our writing. We can study and record and preserve what we learn. We can ensure that future generations will know the temple's age and wonder at their builder's achievement, even if we can't answer every question. But some questions will remain unanswered. Some mysteries will persist. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the temples should keep some secrets. Maybe the spiral meaning should remain enigmatic. Maybe the silence that fell after the temple age ended is itself part of the story. A reminder that nothing lasts, that cultures rise and fall, that memory is fragile and precious. The Bronze Age people who cremated their dead in Tarxian Temple didn't know they were standing in a structure 500 years old, built by people whose sophistication rivaled or exceeded their own. They just saw old stones, useful spaces, ancient mysteries. We see more now, but we still see mysteries. The stones are still teaching us, still revealing secrets, slowly, patiently, still connecting us to a lost world. And perhaps they always will be. Perhaps that's what they were built for, not to preserve specific knowledge, but to create enduring wonder, to ensure that 5,000 years later, people would still stand before them and ask, who, why, how? The questions themselves might be the answer, the wondering might be the point. The temples speak across time, not in words but in stone, and we listen, still listening, still wondering, still trying to hear what the builders wanted to say. The temples slept beneath the soil for thousands of years, waiting, patient as stone always is. And then, in the 19th century, they began to wake. not naturally, not through some gradual process of erosion revealing what lay hidden, but through deliberate excavation, through the work of archaeologists and antiquarians and curious locals who wondered what lay beneath the mysterious mounds that dotted Malta's landscape. The first systematic excavations began in the 1830s and 1840s, early work by modern standards, often more treasure hunting than careful archaeology, digging into promising sites looking for artifacts, for interesting objects that could be collected or displayed. But even these early excavators recognized that something extraordinary was emerging from the earth. Temples, stone temples, older than anything they'd expected, older than Roman ruins, older than Phoenician remains, older than anything in the historical record of Malta. The pottery styles didn't match known cultures. The architecture was unique. The age was uncertain, but clearly ancient. As excavation techniques improved, as more sites were opened and studied, a picture began to form. These temples were related, part of a single cultural tradition, built over an extended period, containing similar artistic motifs: the spirals, the animal carvings, the fat lady figurines, evidence of a sophisticated Neolithic culture that had flourished on Malta for over a millennium before vanishing. The discovery of the hypogeum in 1902 was accidental but revelatory. Workers digging house foundations broke through the roof. Instead of stopping, reporting the find, and allowing proper archaeological excavation, they initially tried to hide it, worried that discovery of antiquities would halt construction. But eventually, the site came to official attention, and when archaeologists entered and began exploring the 3 levels of carved chambers, when they realized the scale and sophistication of what had been hidden underground for 4,000 years, it changed understanding of Malta's prehistoric past. This wasn't simple. This wasn't primitive. This was advanced architectural planning, skilled execution, sustained effort over generations. The hypogeum alone, carved entirely from bedrock with stone tools, represented hundreds of thousands of work hours, maybe millions. The painted decorations, the oracle room's acoustics, the careful shaping of chambers to mirror above-ground temple layouts, all of it spoke to sophisticated cultural achievement. Themistocles Zammit, a Maltese archaeologist working in the early 20th century, conducted systematic excavations at multiple temple sites. His work established chronologies, identified different construction phases, began the process of understanding how the temple culture developed over time. He excavated with care, documented findings, published results. His contributions laid the foundation for all subsequent study. The development of radiocarbon dating in the mid-20th century was transformative. For the first time, the temples could be dated with reasonable precision, and when the dates came back, 3600 BCE, 3400 BCE, some sites even earlier, the archaeological world had to reconsider assumptions about where monumental architecture originated and who was capable of creating it. Malta's temples weren't derivative. They weren't copies of Egyptian or Mesopotamian models. They were original, indigenous, developed independently by island communities. They predated the great monuments of the Near East and Egypt. They were, in a very real sense, among the first experiments in monumental stone architecture anywhere in the world. That recognition brought prestige. UNESCO designated multiple temple sites as World Heritage Sites, acknowledging their global significance. Tourism increased, conservation efforts intensified. The temples became symbols of Malta's cultural heritage, icons of national identity. But recognition also brought questions, new questions, deeper questions, questions that persist today despite decades of research. Why Malta? Why did temple building flourish on these small islands when similar developments didn't occur on other Mediterranean islands? What was unique about Malta's environment, its population, its cultural evolution that produced this particular expression of Neolithic religion? Some researchers point to isolation. Malta was cut off from mainland Europe, allowing cultural traditions to develop without outside interference. Island populations often develop distinctive practices. Perhaps the temple tradition was Malta's unique response to island life, to the particular challenges and opportunities of this environment. Others emphasize connection. Trade networks linked Malta to Sicily, to Italy, to North Africa. Obsidian and other materials came from distant sources. Ideas travelled with trade goods. Perhaps Malta's temple builders were influenced by architectural developments elsewhere. adapting and transforming those influences into something distinctly their own. Why did it end? Environmental collapse seems likely, but the exact mechanisms remain debated. Was it climate change, a shift to drier conditions that made agriculture unsustainable? Was it deforestation and soil depletion from generations of farming? Was it population pressure exceeding the island's carrying capacity? Some combination of all these factors, or was it cultural? Did the temple religion lose credibility when it failed to prevent hardship? Did new beliefs arrive with Bronze Age migrants and replace the old? Did social structures change in ways that made maintaining the temples impossible or unnecessary? We have theories, we have evidence, but we don't have certainty. The archaeological record shows the end but doesn't fully explain it. Modern technology offers new tools. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath known temples, suggesting undiscovered chambers or features. Three-dimensional laser scanning creates precise models of temple architecture, allowing virtual reconstruction and analysis. DNA analysis of bones from burial sites traces genetic relationships, migration patterns, population changes over time. Each new technique reveals new details, but each answer generates new questions. That's how archaeology works. You solve one mystery and uncover three more. The temples give up their secrets slowly, reluctantly, one fragment at a time, and some questions may never be answered. What songs did they sing in the temples? What language did they speak? What myths explained the creation of the world, the origin of the islands, the movements of the stars? What did the spirals mean to them? Not to us, with our interpretations, but to the people who carved them. Those answers are gone. Lost in the silence that fell when the last person who knew died without passing the knowledge on. We can speculate, infer, imagine, but we can't know. Not with certainty. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps mystery is itself valuable. Perhaps not everything should be explained, catalogued, fully understood. The temples preserve an element of otherness, of genuine difference from our own culture. They remind us that humans have created meaning in ways we can't fully grasp, that sophisticated thought and complex belief don't require the trappings of civilization we're familiar with. Standing before the temples today, even with all we've learned, you still feel wonder. You still ask questions. The stones still provoke that response, that sense of encountering something larger, older, more enduring than yourself. Maybe that's what the builders wanted. Not to be understood completely, but to create something that would inspire wonder. To build monuments that would last long enough, be mysterious enough, be impressive enough that people thousands of years later would still pause, still look, still wonder. If so, they succeeded. Brilliantly, the temples are rediscovered, studied, protected, but they're not solved. They're not finished mysteries, closed cases, fully explained phenomena. They're still alive with questions, still generating wonder, still connecting us to a lost world through the simple act of making us wonder about it. The great questions remain. And that's perhaps the greatest achievement of all, to create something so enduring, so enigmatic that 5,000 years later people are still asking why, still trying to understand, still feeling the weight of mystery and time. The stones wait, patient, silent, holding their secrets, sharing just enough to keep us curious, to keep us coming back, to keep us wondering what else might be hidden in their silence. The temples didn't disappear. They couldn't. Stone is too permanent for that, too stubborn, too patient. Even when the meaning vanished, even when the builders became nameless and their purposes unknowable, the stones remained, weathered, partially buried, silent, but there. That's the paradox of monuments. They're built to preserve memory, to ensure that something endures beyond the lifespan of individuals or even generations. And in that sense, Malta's temples succeeded completely. They're still here, 5,000 years later, still standing. But the memory they were meant to preserve, the beliefs, the rituals, the meanings, that was lost anyway. The containers survived. The contents evaporated. Or did they? Because something did survive. Not the specific knowledge, but the fact of the achievement itself. The evidence that human communities, without cities or writing or metal, were capable of creating sophisticated architecture, of encoding astronomical knowledge in stone, of sustaining complex projects across generations. That knowledge survived because the temples themselves survived. They became their own witnesses, their own testament to what humans can accomplish when we work together towards something larger than ourselves. The legacy isn't what the builders intended, perhaps. They wanted to preserve their religion, their way of understanding the cosmos, their relationship with whatever sacred forces they believed governed existence. Instead, they preserved something more universal, evidence of human creativity, human determination, human capacity for wonder and meaning-making. That's what we inherit when we stand before these temples today. Not Bronze Age religion, that's gone, irrecoverable, but something deeper, a connection to the human impulse that created them. The same impulse that builds cathedrals and mosques and temples in every culture across every era. The need to create sacred space, to mark important things in permanent materials, to say through architecture and art, this matters, remember this. And we do remember, even if what we remember isn't quite what was intended, even if we've had to rediscover it through archaeology rather than inheriting it through unbroken tradition. The rediscovery itself tells a story. It tells us that forgetting isn't final, that buried knowledge can resurface, that mysteries can be partially solved, even if full understanding remains elusive. The 19th century excavators who first opened Malta's temples couldn't have known what they were revealing. They expected Roman ruins, maybe Phoenician remains. Instead, they found something older, something that predated Mediterranean civilization as they understood it, something that challenged assumptions about where and when monumentality began. Each generation of archaeologists since has added pieces to the puzzle. Early excavators documented what they found, collected artifacts, began cataloguing sites. Mid-20th century researchers applied radiocarbon dating, established chronologies, connected Malta's temples to broader Neolithic developments across Europe. Recent investigators use ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, isotope studies to extract information that earlier archaeologists couldn't access. The technology improves, the methods become more sophisticated, but the fundamental questions remain. Why here? Why then? What did it mean? And the temples, patient as always, give up their answers slowly, a fragment at a time. Never quite enough to satisfy, always enough to keep us curious. Even now, excavations continue, conservation projects work to protect the temples from weather and tourism and time. Researchers publish new analyses, new theories, new interpretations of old evidence. The temples are active sites of inquiry, not finished chapters in a history book. They're still teaching us, still revealing secrets we didn't know were hidden, and visitors still come, thousands every year, from Malta and from around the world. They walk through the same chambers where Neolithic farmers gathered 5,000 years ago. They touch the same stones, worn now by centuries of weather and modern hands, but still fundamentally the same. They stand where the solstice light enters at Menasdra and imagine what it meant to observe that moment of alignment, that proof that the cosmos moves in patterns, that time is cyclical, that order persists beneath apparent chaos. What do modern visitors take from the experience? That varies. Some see evidence of ancient spirituality, feel a connection to something sacred that transcends specific religious traditions. Some appreciate the engineering, marvel at what humans accomplished with limited tools. Some simply enjoy the beauty of the golden limestone glowing in Mediterranean sun, the way the structures frame sky and sea, the aesthetic achievement independent of meaning. But most, I think, feel some version of wonder. That response the temples still provoke. That sense of standing before something that shouldn't exist according to our assumptions about what's possible in a pre-literate society. The cognitive dissonance between knowing these were built by Neolithic farmers and seeing the reality of massive stones precisely placed, elaborately decorated, astronomically aligned. The temples challenge us. They expand our sense of human capability. They remind us that we don't have a monopoly on sophistication, that ancient doesn't mean primitive, that people who lived 5,000 years ago were as intelligent, as creative, as capable of complex thought as we are. They just expressed it differently, in stone instead of silicon, in astronomical alignments instead of computer calculations, in spirals carved with stone tools instead of mathematical equations written with pens. The continuity is humbling. The stars that guided the temple builders' calendar still move through the same paths. The solstice sun still rises at the same point on the horizon. The alignment at Nizdra still works, still illuminates the intended stones at the intended moment. The limestone still stands, still holds the shape given to it by hands long turned to dust. The spirals still curve, still draw the eye inward to their centres, still provoke the question, what did these mean? And we still ask that question. 5,000 years later, we're still wondering what the builders were thinking, what they believed, what they hoped to accomplish. That continuity of curiosity connects us across the centuries. We may not share their beliefs, but we share the impulse to create meaning, to mark important things, to build something that will outlast us. That's the real legacy. Not specific knowledge about Bronze Age religion, but the demonstration that this impulse is ancient, that humans have always looked at the world and asked, what does this mean? And created structures and symbols to explore possible answers. The temples are evidence that we've been doing this for at least 5,000 years, probably much longer. That meaning-making is fundamental to human consciousness, as basic as language or tool use. Malta's temples aren't unique in that sense. Every culture creates sacred spaces, but Malta's temples are among the oldest surviving examples. They're evidence of how far back this goes, how long humans have been building monuments and carving symbols and trying to connect earth to sky, human to cosmos, temporary to eternal. And they're still here, still standing, still patient, still waiting for each new generation to discover them, to wonder about them, to add their own interpretations to the accumulating layers of meaning that have accrued over millennia. The builders are gone. The Bronze Age people who repurposed the temples are gone. The medieval farmers who used them as animal pens are gone. The 19th century excavators who first revealed them are mostly gone. But the temples remain, outlasting everyone, outlasting empires and languages and belief systems, outlasting everything except the stone itself and the human curiosity that keeps bringing us back. Perhaps that's the ultimate legacy. Not preservation of specific knowledge, but creation of enduring mystery. The temples succeeded not because we remember what they meant, but because we still care enough to ask. Because 5,000 years later, people still travel to Malta specifically to see these structures, still stand in the chambers and feel something, connection, wonder, curiosity, awe, still look at the spirals and imagine meanings, still watch the solstice light enter and feel the alignment of human architecture with cosmic pattern. The story doesn't end. It continues in every person who visits, who studies, who wonders. It continues in you, listening to this now, imagining what it would be like to stand before those golden stones under Mediterranean sky. It continues in the ongoing work of archaeologists and conservators preserving the sites, extracting new information, protecting what remains for future generations. The temples were built to endure, and they have endured. Not perfectly, some are damaged, some are fragmentary, but enough remains, enough survives, enough stands to preserve the essential message. We were here, we created this, we mattered. That message reaches us. Across 5,000 years of silence and forgetting and rediscovery, it reaches us. The stones speak, and we listen, still listening. Still hearing the echo of ancient voices saying the same things humans always say. I wonder, I create, I hope, I build, I endure. The legacy is us, our curiosity, our wonder, our continued engagement with these mysterious monuments. As long as we keep asking questions, keep studying, keep caring about these temples, the legacy lives. The builders may be forgotten, but their achievement remains alive in our attention. And that's enough. That's more than enough. To build something so enduring that 5,000 years later, people are still talking about it, still amazed by it, still trying to understand it. That's immortality of a kind. Not the kind the builders might have imagined, but real nonetheless. The temples stand, the questions remain, and the conversation continues, stretching across time, connecting us to people whose names we'll never know, but whose achievement we can still appreciate, still honour, still wonder at. The legacy is written in stone, but it lives in us, in our wonder, in our questions, in our continued willingness to stand before mystery and let it be mysterious, to encounter the ancient and let it speak in its own silent way. The stones remember. And as long as we remember the stones, the temple builders endure. Not in the way they intended, perhaps, but in the way that matters most. They're not forgotten. They're still here, still with us, still teaching us what humans can accomplish when we believe in something larger than ourselves. And so we return. Back to this moment, back to wherever you are, listening to this now, back to the present, which is all any of us ever really have. The temples still stand on Malta. Right now, tonight, under the same stars that watched their construction 5,000 years ago, the limestone glows faintly if there's moonlight. The chambers are dark, empty, silent. The spirals carved into stone are invisible in the darkness, but they're there, still curving inward to their centres, still holding whatever meaning they held, or perhaps holding no meaning at all anymore except the meaning we give them when we look. The wind moves through the ruins the way it always has, salt-scented from the Mediterranean, warm or cool depending on the season. It doesn't care about history. It doesn't wonder about the builders or their beliefs. It just moves, patient and endless, wearing the stone down grain by grain, the way wind and water and time wear everything down eventually, but slowly, so slowly, the temples have weathered 5,000 years of wind. They'll weather more. Erosion is inevitable, but it's not urgent. The stones will stand long after we're gone, long after everyone currently alive has joined the builders in silence and dust. The monuments outlast the people who care about them, which is both their tragedy and their triumph. Take a breath here. Feel whatever is around you, the surface beneath you, the air on your skin, the particular quality of this moment, this night, this present that you're experiencing. It's unique. It won't come again, but it's also part of a pattern, a cycle. Nights have been happening for as long as there have been beings to experience them. The temple builders knew nights like this, looked up at stars like the ones above you now, the same stars, barely shifted in their cosmic positions despite the passage of 50 centuries. That's continuity. That's what connects us. Not knowledge, not understanding, not shared beliefs. Just the simple fact of being human under the same sky, wondering about the same questions, feeling the same mixture of insignificance and meaning when confronted with deep time. We'll never know everything about Malta's temples. We've accepted that by now. We know when they were built, approximately. We know how, more or less. We know some of what they were for: astronomical observation, ritual practice, communal gathering. But we don't know the why that mattered most. We don't know what the builders believed when they carved those spirals. We don't know what songs they sang or what prayers they whispered or what hopes they held for the afterlife when they laid their dead in the hypodium's darkness. And that's all right. That's as it should be, perhaps. Mystery isn't a failure of knowledge. It's a feature of existence. Some things are meant to remain unknown. Some questions are valuable precisely because they can't be answered. They keep us humble. They keep us curious. They remind us that the universe is larger and stranger and more ancient than our understanding. The temples were built by people who are gone. The knowledge they encoded in stone is partially lost. The beliefs that motivated 1,000 years of monument building have vanished into silence. But something remains. The stones themselves, the achievement they represent, the wonder they provoke, the questions they raise. That's enough, more than enough, to stand before those golden stones or to imagine standing before them and to feel connected, however tenuously, to people 5,000 years gone who also stood there, also wondered about their place in the cosmos, also tried to create something that would matter, that would endure, that would say, "We were here, they were." They are, in a sense, in the stones, in the spirals, in the alignments that still work, that still capture solstice light exactly as intended, in every person who visits and wonders and asks the questions that have no final answers. The night deepens wherever you are. Maybe you're drifting towards sleep. Maybe you're already there, hearing these words in that liminal space between waking and dreams. Either way, let yourself settle. Let the weight of 5,000 years become a comfort rather than a burden. Let the mystery be mysterious. Let the unanswered questions rest unanswered. The temples don't need us to solve them. They just need us to witness them, to acknowledge what the builders accomplished, to carry their achievement forward in memory and wonder, even if we can't carry forward the specific meanings they intended. Somewhere on Malta tonight, the temples rest in darkness, the spirals invisible, the chambers empty, the astronomical alignments waiting for dawn or for the next significant celestial moment. The hippogrium lies beneath the earth, its painted walls hidden from the sun, its 7,000 dead at peace in limestone silence. And the sea moves around the islands, as it always has. The same sea that brought the first settlers from Sicily. The same sea that isolated Malta, that protected it, that connected it to the broader Mediterranean world. The waves arrive and retreat, arrive and retreat. The rhythm hasn't changed, won't change. Some things are older than human history, older than temples, older than questions. The stars wheel slowly overhead. Constellations the builders knew, patterns they tracked, celestial movements they encoded in stone, the same patterns, the same movements. The sky remembers even if we've forgotten. And maybe that's the final thought to rest with. Not that we've forgotten, but that the cosmos hasn't. That the patterns continue whether we observe them or not. That the temples will catch the solstice light next June just as they did 5,000 years ago, whether anyone is there to witness it or not. That the spirals will keep curving, the stones will keep standing, the mystery will keep being mysterious. The story doesn't end. It just continues, quietly, patiently, the way stone continues, the way wind continues, the way time continues, marking moments and seasons and centuries without hurry, without urgency, without conclusion. Rest now. Let the temples keep their vigil. Let the stones remember what language has forgotten. Let the spirals hold their meanings or their meaninglessness with equal patience. Somewhere between breath and thought, between waking and sleep, the ancient world continues, not as history, as presence, not as answer, as question, not as conclusion, as continuation. The wind moves on, the limestone waits, the stars turn slowly, the night holds everything. Subscribe for more nights like this, more ancient stones, more quiet journeys, and in that holding, in that stillness, there's peace. The temples stand, the mystery endures, the silence deepens, and somewhere, always, the stones remember.